The email arrived on a Tuesday, during a lull so profound Leo could hear the persistent drip of a faulty tap in his kitchenette. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears, a stark contrast to the usual hum of the city beyond his Balham flat. The commission was from Metropolitan Chronicles, a magazine known more for its glossy spreads of up-and-coming boroughs than for spectral investigations. The subject line was simple: feature pitch, London's echoes. The editor wanted 1,500 words on the city's most haunted locations, a blend of historical fact and contemporary eyewitness accounts. It was a puff piece, Leo thought immediately, the sort of seasonal filler that would run near Halloween, sandwiched between reviews of artisan pumpkin ales and listings for immersive theater. Yet the fee was good, and the dry spell between substantive journalism jobs had stretched into months. As he read the brief, a specific phrase caught in his mind: personal resonance. The editor suggested starting with a family story, a local legend passed down. It was a standard hook, but it acted like a key, turning a lock he had kept firmly closed for years. The flat seemed to grow cooler. He wasn't thinking of the Tower Ravens or the Grey Lady of Hampton Court. He was thinking of his grandmother's sitting room in Walthamstow, the smell of lavender and loose tea, and the low, serious timbre of her voice after the sun had set. She had told him a story only once, when he was 9 and prone to nightmares. It wasn't about a famous monarch or a headless aristocrat. It was about a place, she said, that remembered too much. A place where the boundary between then and now grew thin as tissue paper. She described a narrow alley near the river, not on any tourist map, where the cobbles were always damp regardless of the weather. On certain evenings, when the fog rolled in from the Thames like a silent gray tide, you might see a woman waiting. She wouldn't look at you, his grandmother had whispered, her knitting needles falling still. She would just stare at the water, her clothes from another century clinging to her as if soaked. And if you were foolish enough to follow her gaze, you might see, just for a second, the pale, small hand of a child breaking the surface of the dark water before disappearing. She called it a story to teach respect for the past, but the look in her milky blue eyes had spoken of something she believed to be true. Leo shook his head, physically dispelling the memory. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked street, the red glow of bus taillights streaking through the gloom. That was childhood fancy, nourished by an old woman's love for a dramatic tale. This assignment was work. It required logistics, research, interviews. He replied to the email, accepting the commission, the click of the mouse decisive in the quiet room. He would treat it with professional detachment. He would visit the famous sites, collate the well-known stories, add a dash of local color from modern-day witnesses, and produce a perfectly serviceable, mildly chilling feature. But as he sat back down, the silence of the flat felt different. It was no longer empty, but expectant. The commission lay before him not as a simple list of locations, but as an invitation. An invitation to walk the same stones, to breathe the same air, to listen in the same silences where those stories had taken root. Pragmatic part of his mind began drafting a schedule. The British Library for Historical Records, calls to arrange after-hours access. Yet beneath the journalistic veneer, a quieter, more curious part was stirring. It was the part that had listened wide-eyed to his grandmother all those years ago. The part that wondered if the tissue paper boundary she spoke of was truly there, and what might happen if someone, equipped with a recorder and a skeptic's notebook, dared to brush a finger against it. The dripping tap marked time in the kitchen. Somewhere across the sleeping city, 15 places waited. The British Library's vast, hushed interior felt like a secular cathedral, a temple of ordered knowledge under a high ceiling of pale wood. Sunlight streamed through the great windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like slow spirits in the air. Leo had come armed with a list of clichés: the tower's headless queens, Drury Lane's grey ghost, intending to find their historical seeds, clip them, and arrange them neatly for his article. He requested files of old newspapers, microfiche reels of local gazettes, and a collection of digitized personal diaries flagged by the archivist as containing unusual civic notations. He began with the illustrated police news from the late 19th century, its lurid woodcuts depicting crimes and curiosities. Amidst stories of burglaries and shipwrecks, he found it, a small column from October 1888, headlined "Disturbance at the Spaniards." It described patrons fleeing the Hampstead pub after midnight, claiming a cloaked figure had materialized at the end of the bar, ordered a pint of porter, and vanished, leaving a full tankard and a single gold coin that turned to dust when touched. Leo made a note, the coincidence a mild professional curiosity. A known pub ghost had a paper trail. Good color. Then he opened a ledger of Metropolitan Police reports from 1912. Constable's meticulous script detailed a complaint from a night watchman at the Natural History Museum. The man, deemed reliable and sober, reported hearing the distinct sound of statuary being moved in the Egyptology gallery. A subsequent inspection found a small Ushepti figure placed deliberately in the center of an empty display case, far from its assigned shelf. No signs of entry were found. Leo felt a prickle at the base of his neck, unrelated to the library's climate control. He added the museum to his list. The personal diaries were more potent, a watercolorist's journal. From 1895, filled with sketches of Chelsea gardens, contained a frantic, ink-blotted entry. The artist wrote of working late, seeing the reflection of a woman in a sapphire blue gown in his window. He turned to find the studio empty, but the scent of lily of the valley lingered for an hour. The description of her face, ethereal yet etched with a profound melancholy, was followed by a hastily rendered portrait that made Leo pause. The eyes seemed to look out from the page, following him. Most chilling was a sheaf of letters from a young governess, dated 1849, found in a donated family collection. She wrote to her sister of the new house near Clerkenwell, built over old prison tunnels. She described nights plagued by a sound like a small dog scratching incessantly at the foundation stones, and once the clear, desperate cry of a child wailing "Mama" from the direction of the coal cellar. The final letter broke off mid-sentence. A librarian's note stated the governess had taken a sudden post abroad and never returned. Leo's detached note-taking slowed. His list of sights was growing, but it was transforming. These weren't just tourist anecdotes, they were echoes of trauma, fear, and unresolved moments, pressed like dried flowers between the pages of history. The modern rumors he had planned to collect, the feeling of being watched at the tower, the cold spot in Highgate Cemetery, were no longer just stories, they were repetitions. The same notes played on different instruments across centuries. He spent the final hour cross-referencing. A 1940s civil servant's memoir mentioned the pervasive smell of cigar smoke and a sense of grim purpose in the Churchill War Rooms, long before it was a museum. A 1923 theater program from the Theatre Royal contained a stagehand's handwritten marginalia about a gray-coated figure seen gliding through the scene dock during a performance of Macbeth. Each fragment, each brittle piece of paper, was a corroboration. The past was not a silent film, it was a recording, and in certain places the needle was still catching in the groove. By the time the soft chime signaled the library's closing, Leo's notebook held 15 locations. The original, cynical list had been entirely replaced. He packed his things, the weight of the old papers seeming to linger on his hands. Walking out into the crisp London evening, the roar of the Euston Road felt jarring, a wave of solid modernity crashing against the silent, persistent undertow he had just been navigating. The city around him, all red buses and neon signs, seemed to overlay another city, a palimpsest of older streets, older sorrows. He had his sights, but he was no longer just compiling a feature. He was following a trail of breadcrumbs left by the dead, and the quiet of the library had settled deep within him, a new and watchful silence. The last of the daylight bled away behind the battlements, staining the Thames a bruised purple. The Tower of London, emptied of its daytime crowds, seemed to exhale, its ancient stones settling into a different kind of presence. The air grew still and carried the damp, mineral scent of the river. Leo stood just inside the Byward Tower gate, the massive iron-studded doors closed and locked behind him. The silence was not empty, but dense, layered with centuries of whispered secrets. His first interview was with a yeoman warder, a beefeater named Edwin Croft, who had agreed to speak after hours. Edwin found him there, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the torchlight, his red and black Tudor uniform appearing almost black in the deepening gloom. Without a word, Edwin motioned for Leo to follow. They walked along the cobbled path towards the river, their footsteps the only sound in the vast compound. The famous ravens were tucked away in their mews, but their absence only heightened the sense of watchfulness. The white tower loomed against the indigo sky, its Norman bulk a stark reminder of the fortress's primary grim purpose. Edwin led him to a stone bench overlooking the Watergate, the infamous Traitor's Gate. The archway was a dark mouth, the water below it black and sluggish, reflecting the first pinprick stars. Edwin did not sit. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the gate. He began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed part of the stone itself. He talked of the history, the facts Leo already knew, the prisoners brought by barge, the final journey from the river to the cells. But then his tone shifted, grew more personal, less rehearsed than the daytime tour. He confessed to a feeling, one he'd never mentioned in his official capacity. A persistent, nagging sensation of being observed, not from the walls or the towers, but from the gate itself. It was strongest on foggy nights when the Thames mist curled around the stonework like ghostly fingers. He described it not as a chill, but as a pressure, a weight of attention that made the hairs on his nape prickle. It was the feeling, he said, of stepping into a room where a heated argument had just ceased, the air still vibrating with unsaid words. Then there were the sounds, not the clank of tourist gates or the chatter of visitors, but the other sounds. The soft, metallic drag of a chain over stone, faint but unmistakable, seeming to come from within the Watergate tunnel. He had heard it a dozen times over his 20 years of service, always when he was alone on his rounds. Once during a winter patrol with a light snowfall muffling the world, he had heard it so clearly he had shown his torch into the arch. The beam had found nothing but wet stone and darkness, but the sound had continued for a few seconds more, a slow, heavy scrape, followed by a faint, watery sigh that was not the river. Leo listened, his recorder a small, dark eye on the bench between them. He watched Edwin's profile, the man's usual jovial, theatrical demeanor completely absent. This was not a performance, this was a quiet confession, offered in the deepening dark to the only person who had asked for it. Edwin finally turned to look at him, his face etched with a weary respect. He said that most warders had a story, a corner of the tower that felt more alive than it should. For some, it was the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, where a scent of old roses sometimes bloomed in winter. For others, it was the Bloody Tower, where a sudden, inexplicable feeling of despair could overwhelm the unwary. But for him, it was always here by the water. It was the gate's memory, he supposed. It remembered the fear, the resignation, the final glimpses of a free world swallowed by shadow. That memory, he believed, had soaked into the very mortar, and on quiet nights it seeped back out. A sudden, sharp cry split the silence, a raven, disturbed in its sleep. Both men started. Edwin gave a thin smile, a crack in his solemnity. He nodded towards the recorder, indicating he was done. But as Leo reached to stop it, a gust of wind swept up from the river, funneling through Trader's Gate with a low, mournful moan that sounded, for one impossible second, like a stifled sob. The torchlight flickered. Edwin's eyes went back to the dark arch, his expression once again closed and watchful. The interview was over, but the tower's own testimony had just begun. The Beefeater's final, significant look towards the dark arch of Trader's Gate had been a kind of permission, a silent endorsement of Leo's request to remain a while longer. Edwin Croft had provided him with a temporary pass and a warning to stay within the outer ward, his heavy keys jangling as he departed, his footsteps fading into the tower's immense quiet. Leo was alone. The vast star-flecked sky pressed down on the fortress, and the ancient stones seemed to exhale a colder breath now that the last living witness had gone. He walked slowly back towards the scaffold site, the patch of gravel where the block had once stood. The daytime placards describing the executions felt like feeble attempts to contain a violence that had soaked into the earth. He sat on a low, cold parapet, letting the recorder run, capturing the ambient silence, a silence that was not truly silent at all. It hummed with the distant, ceaseless murmur of the city beyond the walls, a sound like a far-off sea. But beneath that, there was a deeper stillness, a listening quality. He waited, his breath pluming in the chill air, his senses stretched taut. He was listening for the drag of chains Edwin had described, but the night offered only the occasional rustle of a night bird or the sigh of the wind through the crenellations. Then it came. Not a chain, but a sound far more human and infinitely more sorrowful. A sob, low and guttural, choked as if by a hand clamped over a mouth. It seemed to originate not from any one direction, but from the very air around the scaffold site itself. Leo froze, his fingers tightening on the cold stone. The sound came again, a wretched, shuddering inhalation followed by a muffled wail of pure despair. It was a woman's cry, thick with tears and a terror so absolute it felt like a physical touch in the dark. His rational mind scrambled for an explanation, a trick of the wind through an arrow slit, a distant siren distorted by the walls, but the sound was too clear, too agonizingly close. It held a resonance that vibrated in the marrow of his bones, a frequency of ancient grief. He stood slowly, his movements cautious, as if afraid to shatter the moment. His eyes scanned the darkened green, the pale gravel of the execution site, and then he saw her. For less than 3 seconds, 10 paces from where the block would have been, a figure coalesced from the gloom. She was translucent, a sketch made of moonlight and mist, yet her form was unmistakable. She wore the heavy, elaborate gown of the Tudor period, the fabric appearing both sumptuous and insubstantial. Her head was bowed, her face hidden by a fall of spectral hair, but the curve of her shoulders spoke of utter defeat. She was not walking, nor kneeling, but simply standing in an attitude of profound, hopeless waiting. The air around her shimmered like heat haze on a summer road, and through her form, Leo could see the dark outline of the tower's inner wall. A cold far deeper than the night's chill radiated from the spot, washing over him in a wave that stole his breath. The sorrowful sobbing seemed to emanate from her, though her ghostly form made no movement. It was a sound that spoke of a final, desperate prayer whispered into the cold dawn air, of the bite of the axe not yet felt but already known. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. Not a fade, but a cessation. One moment she was a portrait in mist and misery, the next there was only empty night. The sobbing ceased abruptly, cut off as if by a blade. The intense cold retreated, leaving Leo shivering violently in its aftermath. The ordinary chill of the November night felt almost warm by comparison. He stood there for a long time, his heart hammering against his ribs. The recorder's tiny red light glowed steadily, a testament to what had just occurred. He played it back, his hand trembling. The first minutes contained only his own breathing and the wind. Then, clear and undeniable, the raw, mournful sobs filled his headphones, followed by the stark silence of his own shock. He had captured the sound. He had seen the source. Looking at the empty gravel, Leo understood something fundamental. The beefeater's story of chains was one kind of haunting, an echo of a process, a journey into captivity. What he had just witnessed was something else entirely. It was the haunting of the moment itself, the eternal recurrence of a specific catastrophic point in time. The woman in the Tudor gown was not wandering the walls. She was pinned there, forever standing at the brink of her annihilation. His grandmother's words about places that remembered too much echoed in his mind. This place remembered not just facts, but raw, unprocessed emotion. He left the scaffold site as the moon climbed higher, its cold light bleaching the color from the world. The tower's ravens, unseen, rustled in their cages. As he passed through the gate where the beefeater had let him out, Leo glanced back once. The fortress was a silhouette of pure black against the sky, a repository of endings. His professional detachment lay in shreds, back on the cold parapet. He had come to document stories, but the story had reached out and touched him with an icy, sorrowful finger. The feature was no longer an abstraction. It was a pursuit, and he was now irrevocably the pursued. Highgate Cemetery in the dying light was a city of the dead built on a hillside, a Victorian labyrinth of weeping angels, broken columns, and ivy-choked mausoleums. The air smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and cold stone. Leo arrived just before the gates. Officially closed to the public, having secured special permission for a twilight meeting. The western section, where he was to meet his contact, felt less like a graveyard and more like a forest that had slowly consumed its monuments. Roots cracked through paving stones, and winged cherubs peered blindly from thickets of bramble. The last of the sun cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. His contact was a paranormal investigator named Mara Vance. He found her by the Egyptian Avenue, a dramatic colonnade leading into the Circle of Lebanon. She was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in practical dark clothing, her face sharp and intelligent in the gloom. She carried no dramatic equipment, only a small, high-sensitivity thermal camera hanging from her neck. She greeted him with a curt nod, her eyes already scanning the deepening shadows between the tombs. She began speaking immediately, her voice low and matter-of-fact, as if discussing geologic formations. She talked of the cemetery's famous residents Karl Marx, George Eliot, but her interest lay in the unnamed, the unquiet. For over a decade, she had been cataloging phenomena here, building a map of cold spots, electromagnetic fluctuations, and visual anomalies. Most were faint, she said, residual echoes of grief. But one pattern was persistent and distinct. She called it the tall figure. It was not tied to any specific grave. It was a wanderer. She described it as a silhouette of profound darkness, often seen standing motionless beneath the great cedar trees or at the end of an overgrown path. It was impossibly thin, she said, with a sense of height that seemed to strain against the very scale of the landscape. But its defining feature, reported by the handful of other credible witnesses she had tracked down, was its eyes. Not glowing orbs, but points of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the surrounding light, yet conveyed a piercing, focused attention. A hunger, she had never felt threatened by it, she insisted, only observed. It was a presence that watched, that studied the living who trespassed in its domain. It was most often seen in this western section, near the vaults, and its appearance was always preceded by a drastic, localized drop in temperature. Her thermal camera had recorded patches of air chilling 10 degrees Celsius in seconds, forming perfect, person-shaped voids in the ambient heat. As she spoke, Leo felt the atmosphere change. The gentle evening chill sharpened, becoming a biting cold that seeped through his jacket. Mara stopped mid-sentence, her head tilting. She wasn't looking at him, but past him into the gathering dark of the cedar of Lebanon's circle. Her hand went to the camera. Leo followed her gaze. At first, he saw only the magnificent, spreading tree, its branches like great arms against the violet sky. Then he saw the space beneath it. The shadows there were deeper, more concentrated than they should have been. Pooled and thickened, resolving not into a shape, but into an absence of shape, a tall, narrow void where the details of the world behind it seemed to blur and recede. He could not see eyes, but he felt the focus, the weight of a gaze that pinned him where he stood. It was a sensation of being measured, not with malice, but with a cold, impersonal curiosity, like a naturalist observing an insect. And then the cold hit him. It was not the gradual chill of nightfall. It was an assault. A sphere of intense, winter-deep cold enveloped him, so sudden and severe it felt like plunging into icy water. The air left his lungs in a shocked gasp, crystallizing in front of his face. The cold was a physical pressure, squeezing his ribs, freezing the moisture on his skin. It was centered on him, a perfect personal pocket of absolute zero. He could see Mara just 2 steps away, seemingly unaffected, her attention fixed on the shadow beneath the tree. But he was locked in this invisible, freezing cell. His fingers going numb, his teeth wanting to chatter. The hunger Mara had described was not a metaphor. In that paralyzing cold, Leo felt it. It was not a hunger for flesh, but for warmth, for life, for the very vitality that his living body radiated. The piercing attention from the dark figure felt like a siphon, drawing the heat from his blood. Time stretched. The world narrowed to the crushing cold, and the 2 points of profound darkness he now felt, rather than saw, fixed upon him from beneath the cedar. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The cold vanished, replaced by the normal evening air that now felt unnaturally warm and welcoming. He stumbled forward a step, drawing in a ragged, grateful breath. The shadow under the tree was just shadow again. The sense of focused attention had dissipated, leaving only the empty, watchful silence of the graves. Mara lowered her camera, her expression a mix of professional satisfaction and something akin to pity. She showed him the screen. The thermal image showed his own form in yellows and reds, but just beside him, where he had stood, was a perfect vertical slash of deepest blue and purple, a human-shaped column of intense cold. And in the background, under the tree, a smaller, darker blot of nothingness where the ambient temperature had simply ceased to exist. She said nothing more about the tall figure. She simply nodded, as if a hypothesis had been confirmed. Leo, still trembling with the aftershock of the cold, understood. He had not just been told a story. He had been used as a piece of evidence, a living thermometer plunged into the heart of the phenomenon. The Highgate hunger was real, and it had tasted his warmth. As they walked back towards the gates in silence, the cemetery felt more alive than ever, a silent congregation of stone and memory, presided over by a tall, dark watcher in the trees who knew now exactly who he was. The Spaniards Inn sat nestled on the fringes of Hampstead Heath like a storybook illustration, its whitewashed walls and dark timber beams glowing under the amber light of old-fashioned lanterns. Smoke curled lazily from its red brick chimney, scenting the crisp evening air with oak and peat. For centuries, it had been a haven for travelers, poets, and highwaymen, its low ceilings and labyrinthine rooms holding whispers of countless conversations. Leo pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping from the quiet, leaf-strewn lane into a warm cavern of noise and light. The pub was comfortably full, the air rich with the smell of roasting meat, spilled ale, and polished wood. A crackling fire dominated the hearth, casting dancing shadows across horse brasses and framed prints of stagecoaches. It felt solid, welcoming, indisputably alive, a stark contrast to the lonely, echoing spaces he had recently inhabited. He found the barman, a man named Jerry with a kind, weathered face and forearms like seasoned oak, during a lull. Jerry listened to Leo's request. Practiced nod, his eyes flicking to the digital recorder placed discreetly on the bar. He poured 2 pints of dark ale, pushed one towards Leo, and leaned his elbows on the polished surface, his voice dropping into a confidential tone that cut through the ambient hum. He spoke of the usual ghost stories first. The spirit of Dick Turpin, the legendary highwayman, said to haunt the upstairs rooms, the playful poltergeist in the cellar that moved bottles. These were the tales for the tourists, the easy folklore. But then Jerry's gaze drifted to a corner of the pub, a secluded nook shadowed by a large oak beam and far from the fire's reach. A single small table sat there, currently empty. That, he said, was for the other one, the regular no one could serve. He described a figure seen only peripherally, always alone, always in that corner. A man in a long, travel-stained coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his features obscured by shadow and the high collar of his cloak. He was not flamboyant or threatening like the Turpin legends suggested. He was quiet still, emanating a profound weariness. Over the years, a handful of sharp-eyed staff and the rare, observant customer had noticed him. He would be there one moment, sitting in perfect stillness, and then gone the next, leaving no impression on the chair cushion, no condensation on the table. But the true signature, Jerry explained, was the drink. Once or twice a year, usually on nights of thick fog rolling in from the heath, a barman would turn to find a full tankard of ale on that corner table. Not a fresh pint just pulled, but one that appeared as if it had been sitting for hours, yet was still topped with a perfect, creamy head. No one would have served it. No one would be sitting there to claim it. The first time, a new waiter had cleared it, only to be quietly but firmly instructed by the old manager to leave it be. If it was the patron's drink, it would vanish on its own, and it always did, by closing time. The tankard would be empty, wiped clean of foam, sitting precisely in the center of the table as if waiting to be collected. No one ever saw it being drunk. Leo listened, fascinated. This was a haunting of routine, of melancholy habit, a spirit not of dramatic violence but of eternal respite, forever pausing on a journey that had no end. He thanked Jerry, finished his ale, and spent an hour observing the pub's ebb and flow, making notes on the atmosphere. As closing time approached, the crowd thinned. The fire burned low and the shadows in the corners deepened. The friendly noise softened to a murmur, then to silence as the last few patrons donned their coats and stepped out into the night. Jerry began wiping down the bar, the clink of glass and the soft slap of cloth the only sounds. Leo offered to help clear the few remaining tables. As he moved towards the back, collecting empty plates and glasses, his path took him near the secluded corner. He glanced at the small table. It was no longer empty. A tankard sat there, three-quarters full of rich, dark ale. Its surface was still, no bubbles rising to disturb the dense head. It looked utterly untouched, yet it could not have been there minutes before. He had passed the spot after the last customers left and seen nothing. A chill that had nothing to do with the dying fire traced a line down his spine. He set down his load of dishes and slowly approached. The air around the table was several degrees cooler. There was no figure in the chair, no shimmer in the air, no sense of a presence. There was only the tankard, a simple pewter vessel beaded with a faint, cold sweat. It sat with a solid, undeniable reality on the worn oak. This was no illusion. Leo reached out a hand, stopping a few inches from its surface. The cold radiated from it, the dry, earthy scent of the ale faint but distinct. He did not touch it. He remembered Jerry's story, the drink that would vanish on its own. He took a step back, giving the corner and its unseen occupant a wide berth. From across the room, he caught Jerry's eye. The barman had stopped his cleaning, watching. He gave a single, slow, knowing nod, then resumed his work, his expression unreadable. Leo finished his tasks under the silent watch of the full tankard. He felt no fear, only a deep, resonant sadness. This ghost was not crying or scratching or watching with hungry eyes. It was simply resting. Taking a moment in a familiar, quiet corner to drink a beer it could never taste, in a pub that had offered shelter centuries ago and now, unknowingly, still did. The ritual was one of remembrance, a phantom muscle memory of a moment's peace stolen from a life of danger and dust. When the last glass was put away and the lights were dimmed, Leo and Jerry stood by the door. Leo looked one last time at the corner. The tankard was gone. The table was bare, wiped clean. The space was just a shadowy nook again, stepping out into the cold, clear Hampstead night. Leo felt the weight of the encounter settle upon him. The Highgate hunger had been a violent, personal intrusion. This was an invitation to witness a private, perpetual solitude. The phantom highwayman wasn't haunting the pub. He was eternally patronizing it, a loyal customer bound by a thirst that could never be quenched. The living world had moved on, the coaches replaced by cars, the heath now a park. But in that corner, a man in a dusty coat still kept his appointment with a drink that would forever be full and forever be waiting. The world above was a cacophony of rain-slicked streets and evening traffic, a symphony of modern London. But as Leo descended the narrow, unmarked service staircase just off Piccadilly, that world fell away, swallowed by a deep, resonant silence. The air changed, growing still and cool, carrying the unmistakable scent of old dust, damp brick, and the faint, metallic tang of rust. This was the hidden entrance to Down Street Station, a ghost in the labyrinth of the tube. Closed to passengers since 1932, it had lived a secret wartime life as a bunker for Winston Churchill's war cabinet. Now, it was a time capsule, a hollow vein in the city's circulatory system. His guide was a transport for London engineer named Anya, a practical woman with a hard hat and a powerful torch that cut the darkness like a blade. She led him through a nondescript door and into the past. The abandoned ticket hall was a cavern of peeling, cream-colored tiles, their Art Deco curves stained by decades of seepage. Advertisements for long-vanished products, soaps, tailors, ocean liners, still clung to the walls in faded fragments, their cheerful promises now grimly ironic. Their footsteps echoed with a hollow, lonely report, the sound absorbed by the immense, listening dark of the tunnels that branched away into nothingness. Anya spoke in a low, respectful tone, her voice barely rising above the drip of distant water. She pointed out the architectural details. The converted offices, the sleeping quarters, but her expertise soon gave way to quieter, more personal anecdotes. She spoke of the atmosphere, which she described not as haunted but as occupied. Maintenance crews, she said, often worked in pairs down here, not for safety but for comfort. The silence was too profound, too watchful. Then she mentioned the whispers, not voices exactly. More like the tail end of a sentence caught in another room, the sibilant echo of a conversation just out of reach. They were heard most often near the old executive bathrooms, where the acoustics were strangely sharp. And the smell, the distinct, rich aroma of cigar smoke, unfiltered and expensive, would sometimes bloom in a room that had been sealed for hours. It never lingered, she said. It would be there, pungent and unmistakable, and then it would be gone, as if someone had just exhaled and walked away. Leo followed her, his own smaller torch probing the shadows, his digital recorder held out its microphone a sensitive ear. They moved onto the eastbound platform. It was a surreal sight, the familiar curved platform, the tracks now empty and littered with debris, the roundels still bearing the station's name staring blankly into the void. The darkness beyond the platform edge was absolute, a wall of black that seemed to swallow the light. Somewhere in the deep distance, a faint, subaudible thrum vibrated through the soles of his shoes, the distant passage of a Piccadilly line train, a reminder of the living city still pulsing through adjacent tunnels. Anya paused, shining her beam down the platform's length. This is where most people feel it, she said quietly. A sense of waiting, not for a train, for something else. Leo stood still, switching off his torch to let his eyes adjust to the profound gloom. The cold was bone-deep here, seeping from the Victorian brick. He held his breath, listening. At first, there was only the drip of water and the hum in the stones. Then, a subtle shift, a pressure change in his ears, as if a door had been opened somewhere in the depths. A current of air, faint and cool, brushed his cheek, and with it, for the briefest second, he caught it, not a whisper, but a murmur, a low, masculine cadence without words, coming from the direction of the dark tunnel mouth. He raised his recorder, its red light a tiny, brave eye in the dark. He pressed record, holding it steady towards the emptiness. They stood in silence for a full minute, the weight of the earth above them pressing down. Anya gave him a look that was both sympathetic and wary. Just as she was about to suggest moving on, Leo's recorder, which had been capturing only the sound of their breathing and the distant drip, played back a fragment through its tiny speaker. He had set it to monitor, and the sound that emerged was crystal clear, cutting through the static. It was a whisper, but not faint or ghostly. It was crisp, precise, and unnervingly close, as if spoken directly into the microphone. Two words delivered with the calm, measured authority of a station master from a bygone era. Mind the gap. The voice was male, middle-aged, utterly matter-of-fact. There was no menace in it, only a routine, automated caution. But in this context, on this empty platform where no gap existed because no train had come for 90 years, it was chilling in its absolute normality. Anya's eyes widened. She hadn't heard it in the air, only through the machine. Leo stared at the device in his hand, the red light now seeming accusatory. The ordinary safety warning, a staple of London life, had become an artifact, a sonic ghost trapped on his recorder. It was a message from the platform's past life, a functional echo of a time when this space was filled with light, steam, and the bustle of passengers. But it felt like more than an echo. It felt like a reminder directed at him. He was the passenger now, standing on the edge of a different kind of gap, the one between then and now, and something or someone from the other side had just politely, clearly pointed it out. The crisp, recorded whisper, "Mind the gap," hung in the cold air of the platform like a spoken sigil. Anya, the engineer, took a half-step back, her professional composure cracking for an instant before she schooled her features into a mask of grim acceptance. She'd heard the stories, but the stories were one thing. The clean, digital capture of a voice from the void was another. She looked from the recorder to the dark tunnel mouth, then to Leo, and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that his pursuit was not in vain. But her body language shifted. She was no longer just a guide, but a companion in a suddenly more charged space. "We should move," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. "The air gets stale." It was a flimsy excuse, but Leo understood. The platform now felt like a stage after a single, startling line had been delivered. The silence that followed was expectant, pregnant with the possibility of an encore. They turned to retrace their steps towards the ticket hall, Anya's powerful torch beam leading the way. As they passed a recess that once held a bench, Leo's own light flickered, the batteries straining against the oppressive damp. He paused to give it a firm tap, a trick that sometimes worked. In that moment of distraction, of focused frustration on the failing beam, Anya moved ahead, rounding a corner where the platform met an access corridor. Her light vanished, swallowed by the brickwork. "Anya," Leo called, his voice flat and dead in the thick air. No answer came, only the echo of his own call, which seemed to fall into the darkness and not return. The sudden isolation was absolute. He was alone on the abandoned platform, the only light his own guttering torch. The immensity of the silence pressed in, a physical weight. He could hear the slow, metronomic drip of water from a leak somewhere in the arched ceiling, and beneath that the faint, ever-present thrum of the live Piccadilly line, a ghost of a heartbeat in a neighboring artery. He took a step forward, aiming for the corner Anya had turned. Then he stopped. A movement at the very edge of his failing circle of light caught his eye. He swung the torch towards the far end of the platform, where the darkness was most profound. There for perhaps 2 seconds a man stood. He was not translucent, not a misty apparition like the Tudor woman at the tower. He was solid, real, a silhouette etched in perfect detail against the sooty brick. He wore a suit from the 1940s, a broad-shouldered jacket, high-waisted trousers, a hat with a neat brim. He stood perfectly still, facing the tracks, his posture one of patient, weary waiting. One hand was in his pocket, the other hung at his side. He was the very image of a London commuter from the Blitz era, caught in a moment of quiet reflection before his train arrived. The details were heartbreakingly normal. The drape of the fabric, the slight shine on the toe of one shoe. Leo's breath froze in his chest. He dared not blink, fearing the image would dissolve. But it was already fading, not from the center outwards, but from the edges in, as if being erased by the surrounding darkness. The solid lines of the suit softened, blurred, and then the entire figure simply was not there. No fade, no wispy dissipation. One moment a man waiting for a train that would never come. The next, an empty stretch of platform stained with decades of grime. In the wake of the vanishing, the air moved. A rush of warm, damp air swept down the platform, flowing over Leo like an exhalation. It was startlingly out of place in the subterranean chill, a breath of humid, almost tropical warmth that carried within it the faint, nostalgic sense of steam, hot oil, and coal dust. It was the breath of the underground as it once was, a living, chuffing beast of machinery and humanity. The warmth caressed his face for a brief, surreal moment, carrying with it a sensory memory of crowded platforms, of newspaper ink and wool coats damp with rain, of the hiss of releasing brakes and the shouted destinations. Then it was gone, leaving the familiar, tomb-like cold to reclaim its territory. The contrast was so violent it left him shivering. "Leo," Anya's voice came from the corridor, her beam reappearing. She hurried back, her face etched with concern. "I called, you didn't answer." He couldn't speak immediately. He pointed his now steady torch beam at the spot where the figure had stood. "Did you feel that? The warm air?" Anya's eyes narrowed. She shook her head slowly. "Just the usual draft. It's always cold." She followed his gaze to the empty platform edge and her expression softened. "You saw him, didn't you, the passenger?" Leo merely nodded, finally finding his voice, though it was rough. "A man in a 40s suit, waiting." "They've seen him before," Anya said quietly, not looking at the spot. "A shadow." Feeling, never so clear, not in years. She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of solidarity. "Come on, let's go up." The ascent back to the rainy Piccadilly street felt like a journey through layers of time. The mundane sounds of tires on wet asphalt, the glow of neon signs, felt alien, too bright, too loud. Leo stood on the pavement, breathing in the cold, clean rain, trying to anchor himself in the present. But the sensory memory of that rush of warm, damp, steam-age air clung to him. It was more intimate than a visual apparition. It was as if the past had leaned close and breathed on him. The patient, solitary figure on the platform hadn't been frightening. He had been profoundly sad. He was not haunting the station. He was forever in transit, eternally paused in the moment before departure, a soul waiting for a train scheduled for a different epoch. And in that fleeting encounter, Leo had not just seen a ghost. He had felt the atmosphere of its lost world, a warm, damp sigh from the depths of history, a final whisper of an era preserved in brick, dust, and longing. The gap had been minded, and for a second he had felt its other side. The hotel stood on a quiet crescent near Russell Square, a grand dame of Victorian architecture whose soot-stained Portland stone facade spoke of a more gracious, gaslit age. Its awning was a deep maroon, its brass fittings polished to a soft gleam. Inside, the air was hushed and warm, scented with beeswax, old paper, and a hint of lavender furniture polish. Crystal chandeliers cast a low, honeyed light over deep armchairs and potted ferns. It was an oasis of ordered calm, a world away from the echoing tunnels and lonely graves. Leo checked in under the pretext of writing a travel piece, his journalist's credentials securing him a specific room, 333. The night porter, a man in his 60s named Albert with the weary, kind eyes of someone who has seen countless guests come and go, handed him the heavy, tasseled key. His fingers, dotted with age spots, lingered on the brass for a moment. "Third floor, sir. End of the corridor on the left, very quiet." There was a pause, a deliberate weighing of words. "It's a popular room, has its charms." Leo feigned polite curiosity. "Oh," Albert's gaze drifted to the ledger, then back to Leo. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur that barely disturbed the quiet of the empty lobby. "Some guests remark on it, a feeling of being looked after. Especially at night." He cleared his throat softly. "More than one has mentioned waking to find the curtains drawn, when they're certain they left them open, or the bedclothes tucked in a little tighter. A motherly touch, you might say." He straightened up, his professional mask slipping back into place. "Enjoy your stay, sir." Room 333 was at the very end of a long, carpeted hallway, where the light from the wall sconces seemed to grow dimmer, absorbed by the deep, floral-patterned wool. The room itself was spacious and high-ceilinged, decorated in shades of cream and sage green. A large bay window overlooked the crescent, its heavy velvet curtains tied back with thick cords. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its damask coverlet impeccably smooth. The air was still and slightly cool, carrying a faint, clean scent of linen and very subtly the floral note of lavender soap. It felt peaceful, impeccably maintained, yet utterly ordinary. Leo unpacked his small bag, placing his digital recorder on the nightstand. He deliberately left the curtains wide open, allowing the amber glow of the street lamps to paint geometric shapes on the carpet. He wanted to see the moon, to have a connection to the outside world. He performed his usual routine, checking the room's corners, the wardrobe, the en-suite bathroom with its clawfoot tub. Nothing was out of place. The silence was the deep, secure silence of a well-built old building, not the listening silence of the tower or the occupied quiet of. Down street, he read for a while, then turned off the lamp, lying in the dark. The room was profoundly still. The distant, muffled sound of a lone taxi horn from Russell Square was the only intrusion. He felt no prickling of the nape, no sudden chills, no sense of a presence. If anything, the room felt gently soporific, cradling him in its historic quiet. The stories Albert had hinted at seemed like the stuff of overactive imaginations or the suggestive power of a good ghost story told at check-in. He drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. He awoke not with a start, but with a slow, gradual return to consciousness. The quality of the darkness had changed. The room was pitch black, a profound, velvety obscurity that pressed against his eyes. The geometric shapes of streetlight were gone. For a disoriented moment, he thought a cloud had covered the moon, or perhaps a storm had rolled in. He fumbled for his phone on the nightstand, the screen's sudden glow blinding in the absolute dark. Its light confirmed it. The heavy velvet curtains were fully drawn, meeting perfectly in the center of the bay window. The thick cords that had held them back were now neatly draped over the brass rails on either side. Leo sat up slowly, his heart beginning a steady, heavy thump against his ribs. He was certain, absolutely, rationally certain, that he had left them open. He remembered the specific act of leaving them open, a deliberate choice against the porter's story. He swung his legs out of bed and walked to the window. The carpet was cold under his bare feet. He reached for the edge of the curtain, his fingers finding the dense, soft fabric. He pulled it back a few inches. The crescent outside was unchanged. The street lamps cast their pools of light on the empty pavement. A clear, star-speckled sky arched overhead. No storm, no cloud. He let the curtain fall back, plunging the room into darkness again save for the phone's glow. He turned, scanning the room. It was exactly as he had left it, his book on the nightstand, his recorder beside it, his shoes placed neatly by the armchair. The bed, however, now caught his eye. When he had gotten up, the coverlet had been disturbed, thrown back. Now, in the faint light from his phone, he could see it had been smoothed down over his vacated place, the edge neatly folded under the pillow in a precise hospital corner. He had not done that. A coldness seeped into him, but it was not the violent, hungry cold of Highgate. This was a different chill, a chill of intimate, unnoticed violation. Someone or something had been in the room while he slept. It had moved silently in the dark, performing a small domestic service. It had closed out the night and tidied his bed. A motherly touch, Albert had said. Leo did not turn on the main light. He stood in the center of the room, the phone's light held aloft like a tiny torch. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a presence that had just departed, leaving behind only the evidence of its care. He felt no fear of malice, but a profound, unsettling eeriness. This haunting was not about tragedy or hunger or waiting. It was about routine, about a duty performed so deeply it had outlasted life itself. A chambermaid who still made her rounds, forever ensuring the guests were comfortable. The night was shut out, the room was in order. He returned to bed, but did not sleep. He lay watching the line where the curtains met, half expecting to see a shadow move, to hear the soft rustle of a starched apron, but nothing happened. The room remained still, perfectly ordered and impeccably, unnervingly tidy. When the first gray light of dawn finally seeped around the edges of the curtains, he got up and opened them wide once more. The room in the pale morning light looked innocent, even charming, but Leo knew the service here was eternal. Checkout was at 11, but for one spectral employee, the work never ended. She was just in the next room, perhaps, or waiting in the linen closet, ready to tuck in the next guest who stayed in room 333, her presence as quiet and efficient as the falling of dust. The backstage labyrinth of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, was a world unto itself, a dusty, shadowy kingdom of towering flats, coiled ropes, and forgotten props that smelled of sawdust, size paint, and the ghost of grease paint. Leo navigated the narrow, sloping passages, his footsteps muffled by decades of accumulated grit. The air was cool and still, thick with the silence of a space that lived for noise and light, now dormant in the afternoon lull before the evening's performance. His guide was a veteran stagehand named Mick, a wiry man with fingers stained by resin and eyes that missed nothing in the gloom. He spoke in the hushed, reverent tones of a cathedral verger, pointing out the iron counterweights of the fly system, the dusty velvet of the grand curtain. They settled on an uptended cable drum in the scene dock, a vast, cavernous space, where entire sets were stored. High above, a single work light cast a weak, jaundiced glow, leaving the corners in profound shadow. Mick offered Leo a flask of sweet, strong tea, his voice dropping as he began the tale. It wasn't about a tragic actress or a murdered playwright, the usual fare of theater ghosts. It was about an audience member. The man in gray, Mick said, his eyes scanning the murky heights where scenery hung like sleeping giants. He's our most reliable patron. Been coming for over 200 years. The story was well documented in theater lore, but from Mick's lips it felt immediate. The specter was a gentleman from the mid-18th century, seen in a powdered wig, a long gray riding coat, and a tricorn hat, often carrying a sword. He appeared only during performances, seen walking along the second circle balcony or standing in the upper gallery, watching the stage with quiet attention. He was considered a good luck charm, a sighting supposedly guaranteed. Successful run, but Mick's experience was more intimate, rooted in the backstage bones of the building. You feel him more than see him back here, Mick murmured, nodding towards a solid, whitewashed brick wall that separated the scene dock from the old rehearsal rooms. A cold draft where there's no draft, a sense of someone passing by just out of the corner of your eye. And sometimes, he paused, sipping his tea. Sometimes, when it's very quiet like now, you might see him walking. Not on the stage or in the stalls, here, in the walls. Leo followed his gaze to the blank expanse of brick. Mick explained that the theater had been rebuilt several times. Passages and doorways had been sealed up, old corridors bricked over. The man in gray, he believed, was not walking through solid matter, but simply following his old route to his seat, a route that no longer existed in the physical world but remained etched in the memory of the place. He was a creature of habit, forever retracing his steps through the architecture of the past. Mick was called away to attend to a faulty lamp, leaving Leo alone in the vast, dim scene dock. The silence deepened, becoming a tangible thing. The distant sounds of the city were completely absent here, buried under layers of brick and history. Leo sat still, letting the atmosphere settle around him. He watched the wall Mick had indicated. It was just a wall, unremarkable, stained with time and the marks of shifted scenery. Then, a movement. Not in his peripheral vision, but directly in front of him. From the shadows to the left of the wall, a figure stepped into the weak pool of light. It was a man tall and erect, dressed in the exact gray coat and tricorn hat Mick had described. The details were crisp, the fabric of the coat appearing thick and real, the silver buckle on his hat glinting dully. His face was in shadow, turned slightly away, his attention fixed ahead as if on a distant point. He walked with a measured, purposeful stride, the heels of his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. Leo's blood turned to ice. He watched, utterly paralyzed, as the figure approached the solid brick wall. There was no hesitation, no change in pace. The man in gray walked directly towards the unbroken surface. For a heart-stopping second, Leo expected a collision, a sickening thud of spectral flesh against brick. It did not happen. The figure passed through the wall. It was not a fade or a dissolve. It was a traversal. The gray coat, the powdered wig, the solid-looking form, met the whitewashed brick and was absorbed by it, like a stone sinking into water. There was no ripple, no distortion. One moment he was there, a picture of 18th century elegance caught in the act of walking. The next, he was simply gone, the wall standing whole and impervious as if nothing had ever approached it. The entire event lasted less than 5 seconds. A wave of vertigo washed over Leo. His mind, trained to seek rational anchors, scrabbled for purchase and found none. This was not a misty apparition in a graveyard or a feeling in a dark room. This was a violation of physical law, witnessed in stark, undramatic clarity. The man in gray hadn't vanished. He had exited the room via a door that existed only in the blueprint of a forgotten time. The air where the figure had passed felt abruptly, sharply colder. Leo stood, his legs unsteady, and approached the wall. He placed a hand flat against the whitewashed brick. Cold and rough, utterly solid. He traced the mortar lines with his fingertips, searching for a crack, a hidden seam, anything. There was nothing. It was a wall. Mick returned, his footsteps echoing. He took one look at Leo's face, pale and stunned in the weak light, and then at the wall. He didn't need to ask. He used his own door, Mick said quietly, not a question. Leo could only nod, his voice trapped in his throat. The stagehand gave a grim, knowing smile. He's on his way to his seat. Matinee doesn't start for hours, but he's always early, a stickler for punctuality. He clapped a resin-dusted hand on Leo's shoulder. Consider yourself lucky, that's a proper sighting, most just get the draft. But Leo didn't feel lucky. He felt unmoored. The encounter at the tower had been emotional, an echo of sorrow. The warm breath in the underground had been sensory, a memory of atmosphere. This was different. This was cognitive, a direct challenge to reality itself. He had seen a man walk through a wall not as a theatrical trick, but as a simple, mundane fact of his existence. The man in gray wasn't haunting the theater. He was simply using it, navigating its current incarnation according to an older, more permanent map. He was, Leo realized with a shudder, the theater's most literal leading lady, the one who knew all the original entrances and exits, who performed his solitary, timeless walk to his seat, show after show, century after century, forever following a path visible. Only to him, the performance on stage was ephemeral. This was the eternal run. The Clerkenwell House of Detention had been a place of forgetting. For over 2 centuries, it had swallowed debtors, radicals, and the merely unfortunate into its damp, lightless bowels, its very purpose to erase people from the world above. Though demolished in the 1890s, its foundations remained, a hidden abscess beneath the modern streets. The entrance was through a nondescript door on a quiet residential square, leading to a steep staircase that plunged into the earth. The air grew thick and cold with each step, heavy with the scent of wet clay, cold stone, and something else, a faint, acrid tang of old fear, like rust and mildew on iron bars. Leo descended into a network of low, vaulted brick tunnels, the original prison cells now just shallow alcoves lining the passages. His guide was a local historian, a thin, earnest man named David who spoke in a rapid, reverent whisper, his torch beam dancing over. The graffiti scratched by long-dead inmates, initials, dates, crude ships. The silence here was absolute, a dead, muffled quiet that seemed to swallow sound whole. It was the silence of the deep earth of buried things. David explained the prison's brutal history, the overcrowding, the disease, the despair. He pointed out where the treadmill had been, where the condemned had spent their last nights. But his historical lecture gradually gave way to the stories passed down by maintenance workers and urban explorers. The tunnels, he said, were not empty. There were sounds, not the grand, tragic echoes one might expect, but small, desperate ones. The skitter of rats, yes, but also a persistent, frantic scratching as if someone were trying to claw through brick with bare, broken nails. And sometimes, very rarely, a voice, a child's voice. "It's always the same," David murmured, pausing by a particularly dark alcove. A little cry, "Mama," just that, clear as a bell, heard by half a dozen people over the years, always in this section. Records show they sometimes imprisoned whole families here. Children weren't spared. Leo felt the familiar tightening in his gut, the journalistic detachment now a thin veneer over a deepening dread. He thanked David, who, after a final, uneasy glance down the tunnel, retreated back to the staircase, leaving Leo alone with a powerful lantern and his recorder. The historian's departure seemed to pull the last vestige of the living world away with him. The silence descended, heavier and more profound than any he had yet experienced. It was a listening silence, a held breath in the dark. He walked slowly, the beam of his lantern revealing the endless, repetitive arches of brick, the floors uneven with settled debris. He stopped frequently, switching off the light, letting the darkness press in, holding his breath to listen. For a long time there was nothing but the hum of his own blood in his ears and the distant, almost imperceptible rumble of a tube train somewhere far above, a ghost of a vibration through the strata. Then he heard it, a soft, frantic scraping, not the skitter of claws, but the gritty, determined drag of something hard against stone. It came from his left, from within the wall itself, or from an alcove just around a gentle curve in the tunnel. It was a small sound, intimate and horrible in its persistence. Scratch, 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 a pause, then again, scratch, scratch, scratch. It spoke of a terrible, patient desperation, a hope not yet extinguished by decades or centuries. Leo froze, his hand tightening on the recorder. He raised it, pointing the microphone towards the sound. The scratching continued, a dry, rasping counterpoint to the hammering of his heart. And then, as if the scratching had been a key turning in a lock, the voice came. It was a child's voice, thin and wailing, choked with tears and the dust of the ages. It did not echo, it seemed to originate in the very air before him. Pinpoint of pure, distilled sorrow. "Mama, mama, please," the words were clear, unbearably plaintive. They were not shouted but wept, the voice of a small one lost in the dark, calling for the one source of all comfort. The sound pierced through Leo's professional resolve, striking a chord of primal pity that left him cold. The scratching intensified for a moment, a frenzied accompaniment to the cry, then both stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. It was a silence that had heard the cry and offered no answer. Leo stood trembling, the recorder's red light a steady, accusing eye in the blackness. He played it back immediately, his fingers numb. Through the headphones, the empty ambient noise of the tunnel hissed. Then, crisp and undeniable, the frantic scratching filled his ears, a sound of pure physical desperation. And following it, clear as if the child were standing beside him, the tearful, terrified wail, "Mama, mama, please." The recording was perfect, sterile in its digital clarity, which made the anguish it contained all the more devastating. He played it again, and again. Each time the small voice clawed at his composure. This was not the sorrow of a queen or the weary routine of a highwayman. This was the raw, uncomprehending terror of a child abandoned in a hole in the ground. The prisoner of Clerkenwell was not a criminal or a rebel. It was a little soul who had died calling for its mother, and whose final, desperate moments were etched into the stone like the graffiti, an eternal, unanswered plea. Leo did not explore further. The weight of the child's cry filled the tunnels, making the air too thick to breathe. He retreated, following his own light back to the staircase, the recorded voice a loop in his mind. As he climbed towards the mundane daylight of the square, the clean air felt like a betrayal. He had captured the sound, the ultimate piece of evidence for his feature, but it felt like a theft. He had taken a moment of ultimate private suffering and sealed it in a digital file. The child was still down there, in the dark, scratching and crying, and Leo now carried its voice in his pocket, a burden of sound more haunting than any sight. The house of detention had not forgotten. It remembered in minute, agonizing detail, and it had just shared its most fragile, broken memory with him. The thunder of modern printing presses was a distant memory on Fleet Street. The great newspapers had long since decamped to glass and steel fortresses elsewhere, leaving the historic thoroughfare to banks, sandwich shops, and the ghosts of ink-stained glory. Yet in the shadow of St. Bride's Church, the so-called Cathedral of Fleet Street, one establishment clung to the old world. The Tipper's Inn was a narrow wedge of a pub, its windows bottle glass thick, its interior a cave of dark wood, smoked mirrors, and the patina of centuries. The air inside was a permanent bouquet of ale, polish, and the faint, sweet-sour scent of spilled wine soaked into floorboards. It was a place of whispers and low conversations, a sanctuary for those who remembered when the street shook with the rhythm of the news. Leo found his contact in a snug at the back, a booth shrouded in shadow. The man was introduced simply as Malcolm, a retired sub-editor in his 80s, with hands that trembled slightly but eyes that were needle-sharp behind thick lenses. He nursed a half-pint of bitter, his gaze distant, as if reading type only he could see. After the formalities, Leo mentioned the purpose of his feature, the hauntings of London. Malcolm's eyes focused, a dry, knowing smile touching his lips. "You've come to the right street," he said, his voice a raspy murmur that blended with the pub's ambient hum. "But you want the wrong ghost. Everyone talks about the hack who drank himself to death at the end of the bar, or the printer's devil who fell into a vat of ink. Nursery tales." He took a slow sip, his eyes drifting toward heavy velvet curtain that separated the main bar from a rear corridor. "The real story is in the cellar, and it isn't a person, it's a machine." He leaned forward, the wood of the booth creaking. He spoke of the pub's history, how it had been built atop the foundations of a 17th-century printer's shop. The cellar, he claimed, wasn't a proper cellar at all, but a sealed-off section of the old workshop, bricked up sometime in the 1880s during renovations. The owners had tried to use it for storage, but no one could stand to be down there for long, not because of cold spots or apparitions, but because of the sound. "A mechanical thumping," Malcolm whispered, tapping a gnarled finger on the table in a slow, heavy rhythm. "Thump, thump, 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 like a great heart beating, or a press. A flatbed press, the old kind, where you'd slide the form in, pull the lever, and the platen would come down with a solid thump to make the impression." He described it as a rhythmic, relentless, metallic percussion felt through the stones as much as heard. It would start just after midnight, he said, and run for exactly 1 hour, never longer, never shorter. No one had ever seen anything, but generations of landlords and late-night staff had heard it. Some said it was the ghost of a master printer, forever running off a special edition that never went to publication. Others said it was the building itself, remembering the industry that gave the street its soul. "They sealed it up properly in the end," Malcolm concluded, sitting back with a sigh of finality. "Put a new floor over the old hatch, built a false wall. No point in keeping a door to a room that holds nothing but noise." He finished his beer, the conversation clearly over. The past for him was a closed book, its final chapter a bricked-up cellar and a phantom press run. Leo stayed in the pub as evening deepened into night, nursing a drink and absorbing the atmosphere. The crowd was a mix of tourists and a few elderly regulars who seemed carved from the same wood as the bar. He watched the staff, looking for any sign of unease, but they moved with the cheerful efficiency of people who either didn't believe the stories or had made their peace with them. As closing time neared, he secured permission from the young manager, a skeptical but amiable woman, to linger briefly after hours for atmospheric notes. She agreed, with a warning that the alarm would be set in 20 minutes. Finally, he was alone. Lights were dimmed, the chairs upturned on tables. The grand old pub was silent, its daytime persona shed. The comforting smells were now underscored by the cleaner scent of disinfectant from a mopped floor. Leo stood in the center of the empty room, his recorder on. He waited, listening to the building settle, the groan of a pipe, the creak of a floorboard cooling, the distant, muffled swell of a siren on Ludgate Hill. Then, as the antique clock above the bar chimed the quarter past midnight, he felt it, a vibration, subtle at first, a tremor in the soles of his feet. It traveled up through the floorboards, a deep, subaudible hum. He knelt, placing a palm flat on the worn oak. The vibration intensified, resolving into a distinct rhythmic pattern. Thump, 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 exactly as Malcolm had described. It was not a loud sound, but it was immensely solid, a physical percussion that seemed to originate from directly beneath him, the mechanical heartbeat of the buried press. He followed the sensation, moving cautiously towards the rear corridor where Malcolm had gestured. The vibration was strongest near the heavy velvet curtain. He pushed it aside, finding a short passage leading to a fire exit and a stockroom. On the left was a plain, painted wall, indistinguishable from any other. Here, the thumping was unmistakable. It pulsed through the air, a steady industrial cadence. Thump, 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 thump. He pressed his ear to the cool plaster. The sound was clearer still, not just a thump but a complex symphony of faint, accompanying noises. The screech of an unoiled roller, the whisper of paper being fed, the hiss of released pressure. It was the ghost of a process, the echo of a full, functioning machine operated by invisible hands. There was no fear in the sound, only relentless, purposeful industry. It was the sound of work that must be finished, of a deadline that stretched into eternity. Leo imagined the bricktop space below the old press, coated in spectral dust, the type set for a news story that would never be read, the phantom printer checking each impression with a critical eye. This was not a haunting of tragedy, but of vocation. The soul of Fleet Street wasn't in the journalists' bylines, but in the machine that made them tangible, and that machine was still running, forever printing its midnight edition in a tomb of brick and earth. The rhythmic thumping continued, unwavering, a metronome for the dead. It was both lonely and profoundly purposeful. Leo recorded until the vibration began to fade, exactly 1 hour after it had started. The final thump was followed by a deep, sighing silence, as if the press had been shut down and covered for the night. The cellar, and whatever it contained, was at rest. He left the tippers in as the first hints of dawn grayed the sky. The silent street felt emptier than before. He had heard the heartbeat of a departed age, a mechanical ghost keeping faith with a rhythm that the world above had long forgotten. The Fleet Street printer wasn't a person to be pitied. It was a function eternally performed. And as he walked away, Leo felt certain that tomorrow night, and every night after, at the stroke of midnight, the press would start its run again, inking stories onto phantom paper in the dark, a testament to the trade that had once made the street tremble. The great vaulted hall of the Natural History Museum was a cathedral of a different faith, a devotion to the deep, slow time of the earth, to bones turned to stone and lives pressed into shale. By day, it thrummed with the chatter of schoolchildren and the awestruck whispers of tourists, all dwarfed by the skeletal grin of the Diplodocus. But now, deep in the night, it was a temple deserted. The only light came from the pale, greenish glow of emergency exit signs, casting long, distorted shadows from the towering skeletons and glass cases. The air, usually stirred by 1,000 breaths, was perfectly still and cold enough to taste, a dry mineral cold that seemed to seep from the fossils themselves. Leo stood just inside the Hintsey Hall, his special access pass a heavy weight in his pocket. He had arranged this visit through a contact in the museum's security office, a man named Roy, who now stood beside him, looking profoundly out of place in his modern uniform against the Victorian terracotta and ironwork. Roy was a large, solid man, but his eyes held a wariness that had nothing to do with potential living. "Intruders, you're sure about this?" Roy's voice was a low rumble, swallowed by the immense space. "It's different at night. The place settles." Leo assured him he was sure. He was here for the Egyptology Gallery, following the thread from the 1912 police report he'd found in the British Library, the Ushepti figurine found out of place, the sound of statuary moving. Roy nodded grimly, as if this confirmed a private suspicion. He led Leo not towards the exhibits, but to a small, brightly lit security office tucked behind a staff door. The room was a bubble of mundane modernity, monitors showing ghostly green feeds of empty galleries, a kettle, a radio playing soft static. "Before you go poking around, you should see this," Roy said, heaving a heavy logbook onto the desk. It was a ledger of nightly incident reports, stretching back years. He flipped it open to a series of entries from the past 18 months, his thick finger tracing the lines. The logs were terse, bureaucratic, and deeply unsettling. 2345, Gallery 64, Egypt. Audio anomaly reported by Officer J. Singh, described as stone scraping on stone. Investigation, no cause found. A few weeks later, 0215, Gallery 64. Motion sensor activation, Sector 7. Visual inspection, negative. Note, display case B12, Ushepti collection found unlatched. Contents appear rearranged. The most recent entry from just 3 weeks prior was the starkest, 0300, Gallery 64. Officer P. Chen reports visual anomaly, shadow movement near sarcophagus, not corresponding to patrol. Investigation, negative. Personal note, gallery feels watched, not returning alone. Roy closed the book with a soft thud. "We don't put that last bit in the official system," he said quietly. "But it's not just Chen, it's a feeling. That whole hall, it's too still. Like it's holding its breath." He handed Leo a heavy-duty torch and a two-way radio. "I'll be on the monitors. Radio if you see anything, or feel anything. I'll come running. But between you and me," he added, his eyes avoiding the bank of screens showing the dark Egyptian gallery, "I'd rather not." The journey from the office to Gallery 64 was a passage through a petrified menagerie. Leo's torch beam cut through the darkness, illuminating frozen moments of predation and flight, a leopard poised to spring, an eagle with wings forever spread. Their glass eyes seemed to track his progress. The silence was absolute, a thick, velvety blanket that muffled his own footsteps. It was the opposite of the listening silence of the prison tunnels. This was a silence of profound dormancy, of things that had been still for millions of years and intended to remain so. Yet, according to the logs, something in this deep freeze was stirring. He reached the archway leading into the Egyptian gallery. The air changed. It grew drier, colder, carrying a faint, granular scent of sand and old linen. The torchlight swept over alabaster jars, a reconstructed burial barge, the gilded face of a funerary mask. The centerpiece was a large granite sarcophagus, its lid slightly ajar as if awaiting its occupant. The hieroglyphs chiseled into its sides seemed to writhe in the moving light. Leo stood at the threshold, not yet entering. Roy was right. The hall felt oppressively still. It wasn't peaceful, it was static, charged with a potential energy that made the skin on his arms prickle. It was the stillness of a held breath before a word is spoken, of a scale perfectly balanced before the slightest weight tips it. He thought of the Ushaptis, the small servant figurines meant to work for the deceased in the afterlife. According to the logs, they were the ones being moved, rearranged as if by unseen hands preparing for a phantom journey. This wasn't a haunting of sorrow or violence, but of ritual. Something was maintaining the tomb, performing eternal upkeep for a voyage that never commenced. He took a step into the gallery, the beam of his torch falling on display case B12. The Ushaptis were there, rows of little carved figures, farmers, bakers, brewers, each face serene in its duty. They looked perfectly orderly. He raised the torch, letting the light play across the sarcophagus, the statues of Anubis and Bastet that stood sentinel. Nothing moved. The silence was a wall, but the feeling of being watched intensified. It was not the piercing hunger of Highgate, nor the stern gaze of the Old Bailey judge. It was a collective, diffuse attention, as if the very artifacts, the jars that held organs, the Shabtis meant to serve, the amulets meant to protect were aware of his presence. A living man with breath and warmth was an anomaly here in this meticulously curated realm of death. He was the disturbance in the stillness. He switched on his digital recorder, the soft click echoing too loudly. He began to speak a low commentary, noting the time, the atmosphere, describing the oppressive quiet. His voice sounded small and sacrilegious amidst the silent gods, and prepared dead. As he spoke, his torch beam wavered across the face of the sarcophagus. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a deeper shadow shift within its open mouth, a pooling darkness that seemed to retreat from the light. He stopped speaking, holding his breath. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. The gallery was holding its breath with him. The logs, the reports, the feeling, they all converged here in this cold, dry air. Something was not right. The museum wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by a function, a sacred, silent maintenance of the afterlife that continued, unsupervised in the deep watch of the night. And he, a temporary night watchman, had just clocked in. The oppressive stillness in the Egyptian gallery was not a mere absence of sound. It was a substance, a jellied medium through which Leo moved with dreamlike slowness. His torch beam, a stark white lance in the darkness, felt like an intrusion, a vulgar modern light probing secrets preserved in stone and shadow for millennia. The hieroglyphs on the sarcophagus seemed to watch its passage with silent, painted eyes. He had stopped his whispered commentary, the sound of his own voice now too jarring for this sanctified silence. The only noise was the soft, almost inaudible hum of the building's climate control, a feeble attempt to regulate an atmosphere that felt fundamentally ungovernable. He focused on display case B12, the home of the Ushapti figurines. According to the security logs, this was the epicenter of the disturbances. He approached slowly, the beam illuminating the rows of small, carved servants. They stood in neat, museum-approved order, farmers with hoes, bakers with loaves, brewers with jars. Each face was a study in serene, eternal duty. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. Was one slightly out of alignment? It was impossible to tell. The case was sealed, the latch secure. Everything was as it should be, and yet the feeling of wrongness intensified. A psychic pressure building behind his eyes. A sudden, sharp click echoed through the gallery. It came from the direction of the sarcophagus. Leo swung the torch. The great granite coffin sat unchanged, its lid ajar, the darkness within absolute. The click had been metallic, precise, like the sound of a lock disengaging or a stone lid settling minutely on its base. He held his breath, listening. The silence returned, deeper and more profound, as if the gallery itself were listening back. Then his torch died. It didn't flicker or dim. It simply extinguished, plunging him into a blackness so complete it felt physical. It was the darkness of a sealed tomb, of the deep earth of a universe before light. He fumbled for the switch, thumbing it uselessly. He shook the heavy cylinder, heard the batteries rattle loosely within. They were brand new. A cold that had nothing to do with temperature seeped from his spine to his limbs. He was blind in a room full of dead gods and prepared corpses. In the absolute black, his other senses screamed to life. The dry, sandy scent of the gallery was stronger now, undercut by a fainter, more disturbing odor, the smell of myrrh and natron, of ancient embalming resins. The air grew colder, leaching the warmth from his skin. And then the sound began. It was the sound from the security logs, but hearing it firsthand in the pitch dark stripped it of all bureaucratic abstraction. Scrap. A low, grinding vibration felt through the soles of his feet as much as heard. The sound of immense weight moving over stone. It came from his left, near the larger statues of Anubis and Osiris. Scrap, thud, a pause, then the scrape again, closer this time. It was not the skittering scratch of the Clerkenwell child. This was deliberate, monumental. Something heavy was being shifted in the dark. Leo stood frozen, his mind a riot of panic and a desperate, clinging rationality. A night watchman playing a trick, a faulty exhibit mechanism, but the darkness was too perfect, the cold too invasive, the sound too laden with a terrible, patient purpose. He took a half step back, his hand groping behind him for the edge of a display case, anything to orient himself. His fingers found cold glass. Then he felt it, a brush against his leg, light, dry, and unmistakable. It was not the swipe of a rat or the flutter of a loose cable. It was a deliberate passing contact, the whisper of woven fabric, of linen or papyrus-thin bandages against the wool of his trousers. It trailed across his calf and was gone. A shudder racked his body, violent and uncontrollable. The air directly around him plummeted in temperature, a pocket of tomb chill that seized his lungs. The scraping sound stopped. In the new, more terrible silence, he heard a different noise, a soft, granular trickle, like sand or fine earth pouring onto a stone floor. It seemed to come from all around him. He imagined the Ushabtis in their case, turning their serene heads in unison, spilling the desert from their shoulders as they stepped from their platforms to begin their eternal work. He imagined the sarcophagus lid sliding fully open, and the dry, linen-wrapped thing within sitting up in the absolute black, its empty eye sockets fixed on the living warmth that had dared to disturb its vigil. Reason shattered. He stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting a pedestal, sending a tremor through the darkness. He didn't know which way was out. The gallery, so orderly by day, was now a labyrinth of unseen obstacles and listening stone. He fumbled in his pocket for his mobile phone, his fingers numb with cold and fear. He dragged it out, swiping at the screen. The sudden, bluish-white glow was a shocking blasphemy, illuminating a tiny, frantic circle around him. In that stark, electronic light, he saw nothing moving. The statues were in their places. The sarcophagus lid had not shifted. The display case was sealed. Everything was as it was. But the air still vibrated. With the memory of the scrape and the spot on his leg where the dry fabric had brushed burned with a cold fire. The mundane glow of his phone did not dispel the feeling. It highlighted it, casting long, leaping shadows that seemed to twitch when he looked away. He didn't use the radio. He couldn't form words. He simply ran, following the bobbing, inadequate light of his phone, fleeing the Egyptian gallery and its oppressive, active silence. He did not stop until he burst back into the harsh, fluorescent safety of the security office, his chest heaving, his face ashen. Roy looked up from the monitors, his own face grim. He had seen nothing on the screens but a man standing still, then stumbling in the dark. But he took one look at Leo and slowly pushed a steaming mug of tea across the desk. No questions were asked. The logbook lay between them, its terse entries now vividly, horribly complete. The museum's night watch was not about preventing theft. It was about bearing witness to the fact that some collections do not rest, that some rituals never end, and that in the deepest dark, the servants of the dead might still be moving, rearranging their tools, preparing for a master's call that echoes across centuries. Leo had not just visited an exhibit. He had briefly, terrifyingly, become part of its eternal protocol. The river had its own weather, a private, creeping climate that clung to the stones and swirled in the hollows beneath the bridges. On the south bank, the cheerful daytime throng of book markets and street performers had long since dissipated, leaving the wide promenade to the determined nightwalkers and the city's unseen residents. A damp, chill fog was rolling in from the east, muffling the lights of the skyscrapers in the city, turning the neon of the London Eye into a smeared, ghostly halo. The Thames itself was a black, oily ribbon, its surface swallowing the weak reflections, its current moving with a silent, muscular patience. Leo walked near thus. River wall, the collar of his coat turned up, his breath pluming in the jellied air. The sounds of the city, the distant rumble of traffic on Waterloo Bridge, the faint thump of music from a bar, were softened and distorted by the fog, becoming the murmurs of a drowned world. He found the man bundled in a nest of blankets and cardboard in the lee of a concrete stairwell, a few hundred yards from the bridge's southern abutment. A small, battery-powered lantern cast a jaundiced circle on the damp pavement. The man's name was Joseph, and he had the weathered, resigned face of someone for whom the riverfront was both home and a front-row seat to its secrets. He accepted the hot tea Leo offered from a thermos, his gnarled hands trembling slightly around the plastic cup. After a few sips, he began to speak, not looking at Leo, but at the fog-shrouded water. "She walks in," Joseph said, his voice a dry rasp like the rustle of dead reeds. "Not jump, walks, slow, like she's going for a paddle on a summer's day, only it's the dead of night and she's dressed in old clothes, a long gray dress soaked through before she's even knee-deep." He took a long sip, his eyes distant. Seen her 3 times, always in the fog, always near the bridge. She goes in up to her waist, stops and just stands there, facing the current, like she's waiting for it to take her. Then she turns her head, looks right back at the bank. Not at me, not at anyone, just at the bank. And then she's gone, not a splash. Just. River takes her. He described her face as pale as a waterlogged moon, her expression not of fear, but of a terrible, exhausted resignation. A drowner, not a jumper. Someone for whom the river was not a sudden end, but a slow, inevitable conclusion. Other rough sleepers had stories, he said. Some claimed to hear a woman singing a lullaby on foggy nights, the voice seeming to come from the water itself. Others spoke of finding small, wet footprints on the stones that led from the river's edge to nowhere. Joseph believed she was looking for something, or someone. A child perhaps lost to the water long ago. Her walks were a search, an endless, hopeless wading into the dark to find what the Thames had swallowed. Leo listened, the cold from the damp stones seeping through his shoes. The story resonated with a grim, tidal pull. It felt older than the Gothic tragedies of the Tower or the theatrical hauntings of Drury Lane. This was a primal haunting, elemental and repetitive as the river's own tides. He thanked Joseph, leaving the rest of the thermos with him, and walked on, closer to the water. The fog thickened, coiling around the lampposts, reducing the world to a sphere of wet gray mist and the soft, lapping sound of the tide against the embankment. He found a bench and sat, watching the opaque wall of fog where he knew the river to be. The atmosphere was profoundly lonely. The cheerful lights of the Oxo Tower and the National Theatre were mere smudges of color in the gloom. He thought of the woman in the gray dress, wading into the black water, her search eternal. He thought of his grandmother's story, the pale hand of a child breaking the surface. The Thames was London's great liquid memory, a repository of everything it had carried away, refused treasures and lives. It stood to reason that some of those lives might still be trying to climb out, or, like Joseph's drowner, forever walking back in. Time lost its meaning in the muffled world. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, but the cold had thoroughly penetrated his layers when he finally decided to leave. As he stood, a movement in the fog caught his eye. Down by the water's edge, where a set of slime-slick steps descended into the Thames, a figure stood. She was exactly as Joseph had described, a woman in a long, drab dress that hung heavy and wet, clinging to her legs. The fabric was the color of the fog itself. She stood perfectly still, facing the water, her back to the embankment. Her hair, dark and lank, hung down her shoulders. She was ankle-deep in the river, the black water swirling silently around her. She made no sound, gave no indication she was aware of his presence. She simply stood, a statue of sorrow planted in the tide. Leo froze, his blood turning to ice water. This was no peripheral shadow, no trick of the light. She was solid, real, a stark silhouette against the slightly lighter gray of the fog over the river. The air around him grew colder, damper, carrying a new scent, the smell of river mud, of wet wool, and something faintly organic like decaying flowers. He could hear the water lapping at her submerged feet. Then slowly, as if moved by the current itself, she began to turn her head. It was a languid, dreadful motion. She was not looking at him, but past him, towards the bank, towards the city she had left behind. Her profile emerged from the curtain of her hair. Joseph was right. Her face was pale, ghastly white, her features blurred by moisture and distance, but etched with an expression of bottomless, weary grief. Her eyes were dark hollows. She completed the turn, staring directly at the stone wall of the embankment for a long, agonizing moment. In that gaze, Leo felt the weight of centuries of loss, a longing so vast it had become a geographical feature, as permanent as the river itself. This was no ghost seeking attention. This was a phenomenon, a piece of the landscape's sorrow made manifest. And then she turned back to face the deep, dark channel. Without a ripple, without a sound, she took a step forward, then another. The water rose to her knees, her thighs, her waist. She did not falter. She walked deeper, her form beginning to blur and blend with the fog and the dark water. At the moment she should have been submerged, she simply faded, dissolving into the Thames like a lump of sugar in tea. One moment a figure of profound sadness, the next, only the shifting fog and the implacable, silent flow of the river. Leo stood transfixed, his heart hammering. The cold was now inside him. He had witnessed the Thameside drowner. She was not a story. She was a process, as regular as the tide, a perpetual reenactment of a final, terrible decision. Her haunting was not in a building or a tunnel, but in a liminal space, the threshold between land and water, between life and oblivion. She was the river's memory of all the lost souls it had ever claimed, walking one of them back into its depths, over and over, in the hope that this time perhaps the outcome would be different. The fog curled around him, damp and intimate. Somewhere out in the black water, a woman in a gray dress was still walking, and the Thames, London's great, patient ghost, held her in its endless, dark embrace. The air in the Churchill war rooms was different from the other places. It wasn't the dry, ancient cold of a tomb or the damp chill of a riverbank. It was a controlled, museum-quality coolness, maintained to preserve the Maps, the telephones, the empty ashtrays. Yet beneath the scent of polished linoleum and informational placards, Leo detected a deeper, more persistent odor, a rich, smoky aroma of cigar, not the cheap kind, but something expensive and heavy, layered over the faint, sweet tang of aged brandy. It was a smell that spoke of power, of stress, of long nights under the earth while the city above burned. His contact was not a tour guide, but a mid-level civil servant named Alistair, who had arranged a private, after-hours viewing through a labyrinth of bureaucracy. Alistair was a man in his 50s, with the impeccably bland demeanor of a career government man, his suit a shade of gray that seemed designed to blend into concrete. He met Leo at the unmarked staff entrance on Clive's steps, his handshake dry and brief. He spoke little as they descended into the bunker, his silence more telling than any ghost story. It was the silence of institutional discretion, of things known but never officially acknowledged. They moved through the cramped, low-ceilinged corridors, past the transatlantic telephone room and the map room with its great colored charts still pinned to the walls. The place was a perfect time capsule, a monument to organized desperation. Alistair finally paused outside the door to the cabinet room itself. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he turned to Leo, his expression carefully neutral. "You understand none of this is for attribution," Alistair began, his voice a low monotone. "The department would have my head, but since you're here and you're asking, there are stories, not from the public, from us, the people who work here late or who are tasked with overnight maintenance." He spoke not of apparitions, but of environmental anomalies, cold spots, he said, that had no business existing in a climate-controlled environment. Not the gentle chill of an old building, but sudden, plunging pockets of winter that would form in the middle of a corridor or around Churchill's own desk chair. Security sensors, calibrated to detect movement and temperature fluctuations, would sometimes trigger in the dead of night in sealed rooms. The logs would show a rapid, localized drop of 10 degrees in the Prime Minister's bedroom, lasting precisely 3 minutes, then reverting to normal. And the smells. The brandy and cigar were the most common, often reported by the first staff to arrive in the morning, lingering in the cabinet room like the ghost of a particularly intense meeting. Once, a night cleaner had insisted she'd heard the low murmur of voices and the clink of a glass from behind the closed door. When she'd looked in, the room was empty, but the scent of spirits was so strong it made her eyes water. "But the most distinctive report," Alistair said, his eyes flicking towards the closed door, "concerns a sound. It's only been logged a handful of times, always by personnel working alone, always after midnight." He described it as a single, solid, decisive thump, not a bang, not a crash. A percussive, weighty impact, like a firm fist being brought down on a heavy wooden table. It was heard without exception coming from the cabinet room. Investigations always found nothing. The great map table, scarred and stained by history, sat undisturbed. Alistair produced a key and unlocked the door. He gestured for Leo to enter alone. "Take your time. I'll be in the map room. The sensors are off for our visit." "You won't be disturbed," he said the last word with a faint, ironic emphasis before melting back into the shadowy corridor. Leo stepped into the cabinet room. It was smaller than he'd imagined, dominated by that long, rectangular table, surrounded by simple wooden chairs. Churchill's place at the center was marked by a larger armchair and an ashtray. The air was still and cool, the historical weight of the place almost audible, the weight of decisions that had saved or condemned millions. He walked slowly around the table, running a hand over the back of the armchair. The leather was cold and dry. He sat in a chair along the side, not daring to take the central seat, and switched on his recorder, placing it on the table. He didn't speak. He simply listened, letting the profound, insulated silence of the bunker envelop him. The distant hum of the ventilation system was the only sound. He closed his eyes, trying to feel beyond the museum exhibit, to the place it had been, a nerve center vibrating with fear, urgency, and colossal will. At first, there was nothing, just the cool, still air and the smell of old paper and wax polish. Then a subtle shift. The temperature in the corner of the room near Churchill's ashtray seemed to drop. It wasn't a dramatic plunge, but a gradual, creeping cold that seeped into the space, distinct from the ambient chill. Leo opened his eyes. The air above the armchair appeared to waver slightly, like heat haze off a road, but cold, a distortion of pure low temperature. And with it the smell intensified. The rich, peaty scent of fine brandy bloomed in the room, accompanied by the robust, oily aroma of a lit cigar. The smells were not faint or ghostly. They were vivid, present, as if someone had just poured a snifter and taken a contemplative puff. Leo sat perfectly still, his breath held. The cold spot solidified, a perfect sphere of winter centered on the armchair. The brandy and cigar bouquet was now so strong he could almost taste it. The room felt no longer empty, but occupied, not by a visible figure, but by a presence of immense concentration and burdensome resolve. It was a pressure in the air, a density of personality that seemed to bend the light around the head of the table. Then it happened. A single, shocking thump reverberated through the wooden floor and up the legs of his chair. It came from the center of the map table, a sound of solid, unyielding impact. It was not loud, but it was immensely dense, a sound of finality, of a decision made. And a core set in stone. It was the sound of a fist, driven by a will of iron, hitting the table to punctuate an argument, to silence a room, to mark a point of no return. In the echo of that sound, the cold spot vanished. The rich smells of brandy and cigar evaporated, leaving only the sterile museum air. The pressure lifted. The room was just a room again, a carefully preserved slice of history. Leo looked at the map table. There was no mark, no indentation. But the sound still vibrated in his bones. He stopped the recorder and played it back. The first minutes were silent. Then, clear and isolated in the digital file, the single, definitive thump echoed from the speakers. It was a sound of government, of war, of history being hammered into shape. It was not the ghost of a man, but the ghost of a moment of unbearable pressure and decisive action, echoing forever in the reinforced concrete where it had first been born. He left the cabinet room, finding Alistair studying a map of the Atlantic. The civil servant looked up, reading Leo's face. He didn't ask, he simply nodded, a small, weary acknowledgement. Some secrets, his expression said, were not meant to be kept, only discreetly confirmed. The government ghost wasn't a specter that walked, it was a function that repeated. A cold spot of focused intensity, the aroma of fortitude, and the sound of a fist on a table, forever settling the fate of the world in the deep, quiet dark. The heart of Soho after midnight was a creature of two faces. At street level, it still pulsed with a weary, neon-drenched vitality, the last shouts from crowded pubs, the thump of bass from basement clubs, the sizzle of late-night kebabs. But descend a single flight of stairs and you entered another world entirely. Here, in the warren of cellars and backrooms, lived the true, enduring soul of the district, jazz. It was in these subterranean spaces, smelling of spilled beer, ancient damp, and the warm, woody scent of instrument. Cases that the music had survived every changing trend, played by spirits both living and otherwise. The club was called the Velvet Note, a name worn smooth by decades. Its entrance was a plain black door below a Chinese restaurant, marked only by a small, purple bulb. Leo pushed it open and was met by a wave of warm, brassy sound and the low murmur of an enraptured crowd. The room was long and narrow, the ceiling a labyrinth of pipes painted black, the walls lined with faded photographs of legends. A quartet was on the small, dimly lit stage, weaving a complex, smoky rendition of Round Midnight. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, perfume, and cigarette smoke clinging to fabric from a time when smoking indoors was still allowed. He was there to meet the owner, a man named Gabriel, who held court at the end of the scarred mahogany bar. Gabriel was in his 70s, with a magnificent head of silver hair and eyes that held the melancholic wisdom of 1,000 last sets. He shook Leo's hand with a grip that was still strong, his fingers calloused from a lifetime of handling records and instrument valves. After the set ended and the crowd thinned to a few dedicated hangers-on, Gabriel led Leo through a bead curtain behind the bar and into a tiny, cluttered office that doubled as a storeroom. The walls were lined with shelves buckling under the weight of vinyl records in frayed sleeves. "You're here for the skip," Gabriel said, not as a question, but a statement of fact. He didn't wait for a reply. He moved to a vintage turntable on a side table, carefully selected a record from a crate marked Demo Unlabeled, and placed it on the platter. The record was plain black, its center hand-marked with a faded K in blue crayon. "This," Gabriel said, lowering the needle with a reverent touch, "is Carl Kite Malone, tenor sax, best musician you never heard. Died in a room above a butcher's shop on Dean Street in 1959. Tuberculosis. He cut this demo 2 weeks before, only copy." The vinyl hissed, then the music began, a slow, bluesy number, Kite's saxophone voice rich and yearning, full of a technical brilliance edged with profound sadness. It was beautiful. Gabriel listened, his eyes closed, for about a minute. Then, as the sax line began a particularly intricate run, the needle jumped. Not a jarring scratch, but a subtle, seamless skip. The melody vanished, replaced by a different phrase entirely, a cascading, euphoric run of notes that was brighter, faster, more experimentally daring than the recorded track. It lasted for maybe 8 glorious seconds, a burst of pure, unrecorded genius, before the needle found its groove again and slid back into the known, mournful blues. Gabriel lifted the needle. The sudden silence in the cramped room was heavy. "That," he said softly, "isn't on the record." That's the song he was writing when he died. Soho Skyline, never finished, never recorded, but sometimes when this particular copy plays, it skips into a piece of it, like the music itself remembers what comes next, even if the wax doesn't. He explained that it didn't happen every time, maybe once every 20 plays at random. Some nights the record played straight through, a simple, beautiful relic, Other nights, it would gift you those few stolen seconds of a lost masterpiece. The regulars knew about it. They called it Kite's Ghost Chorus. It was the club's most cherished secret, a fleeting communion with a lost artist. Leo, intrigued, asked if there were other phenomena, stories of a presence. Gabriel's expression grew more contemplative. He spoke of the club when it was empty, after the cleaners had left and the lights were dimmed. Sometimes, very late, you could hear a single, clear note from a saxophone, sustained and pure, seeming to come from the empty stage or the dark balcony. No melody, just a note hanging in the air like a question. And once, a new bartender had sworn he'd seen a thin man. Battered suit leaning against the back wall, listening to the band with a faint, critical smile, before turning and walking through a solid fire door. Gabriel offered to let Leo stay after closing to listen for himself. The offer was made with a strange formality, as if granting an audience. Leo accepted. Hours later, he sat alone at a corner table in the main room. The club was a cavern of shadows now, the stage empty, the only light a faint blue emergency bulb over the exit and the soft glow from Gabriel's office door, left ajar. The smells of the night, alcohol, humanity, music, were fading, replaced by the older, baser scent of the building, dust, old wood, and cold stone. It was a different kind of silence here, not the oppressive stillness of the museum, but a waiting silence, an auditorium holding its breath for the next performance. He sat in the dark, his recorder on the table, for nearly an hour. He heard the distant rumble of delivery trucks on Shaftesbury Avenue, the creak of the old building settling. He began to think nothing would happen, that the stories were just stories, amplified by jazz lore and late-night sentimentality. Then, from directly above him, from the closed and locked club proper on the ground floor, a sound drifted down through the floorboards. It was a saxophone solo. Not a single note, but a full, improvised phrase, clear and vibrant as if the player were in the room. It was a complex, weaving line, at once joyful and deeply lonely, technically flawless and emotionally raw. It was the sound he'd heard in the skip, but expanded, alive and breathing. It echoed for perhaps 10 seconds in the empty darkness, a ribbon of pure musical thought winding through the shadows. And then it stopped, cut off not abruptly, but with a natural, concluding resolution, as if the musician had finished his thought and lowered his instrument. The final note seemed to hang in the air, vibrating in the wood and the glass of the empty bottles behind the bar before dissolving into the silence from which it had come. Leo sat utterly still, a shiver tracing his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This was not a residual echo, not a sound trapped in stone or vinyl. This was a performance, a brief, private recital for an audience of one in the dark. The lost musician of Soho wasn't haunting a place. He was still playing it, dipping into the world to share a fragment of the music that had died with him, forever composing the song he never finished. The skip in the record wasn't a flaw, it was a puncture, a tiny hole in time through which the unwritten music still occasionally flowed. And tonight in the empty club, Leo had heard it not through wax and a needle, but through the very air, a gift from a ghost who considered the night, and a listening ear, his last and most appreciative audience. The small, triangular park in Farringdon was a study in civic camouflage. Neat gravel paths wound between benches and well-tended rose beds. Its few silver birch trees offering dappled shade. Office workers ate sandwiches on the grass in the midday sun, and pigeons strutted with municipal entitlement. It was a place of lunch-hour respite, utterly ordinary, a green postage stamp stuck between the glass cliffs of modern finance and the soot-stained brick of older warehouses. To look at it, one would never guess that the earth beneath this tidy lawn was one of London's most congested cemeteries, a pit where the anonymous dead of the Great Plague had been tipped by the cartload, layer upon layer, until the ground could hold no more. Leo met the historian, Dr. Armitage, by the park's lone informational plaque, which made a discreet, sanitized reference to the site's historical use as a burial ground. Dr. Armitage was a slight, precise man with a dusting of dandruff on the shoulders of his tweed jacket. He spoke not with ghoulish relish, but with the somber cadence of an archivist cataloging a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The term pit is both accurate and inadequate, he began, his eyes scanning the grass as if reading a subterranean text. It wasn't a single hole, but a series of trenches, dug hastily and constantly expanded. Parish records from 1665 describe nighttime convoys, the dead carts, they called them. The drivers wore leather masks stuffed with herbs, and they worked by lantern light. There was no ceremony, just disposal. Pointed with the tip of his furled umbrella towards the center of the park. The deepest concentration is right there, under the bird fountain. Contemporary accounts say the ground shuddered for days as the bodies settled. They poured quicklime between the layers. It was less a burial than a geological event of human suffering. He shared ledger entries that listed numbers, not names. July 14th, 42 souls. July 19th, 107 souls. August 3rd, 203 souls. The numbers climbed into a silent scream. He spoke of the smell that had hung over the area for a generation. Sweet rotten miasma that seeped from the soil, and of the persistent folklore that nothing would grow there for a century. The roses, he noted with academic dryness, were a very recent addition, and their roots were shallow. Leo listened, the cheerful sounds of the lunchtime crowd, laughter, the clink of a bottle, a snatch of pop music from a phone feeling like a cruel overlay. The park was a palimpsest, its modern piece written over a page of sheer statistical horror. He felt a profound dissonance, a cognitive vertigo. This grassy square held more concentrated human despair than the tower's scaffold or the prison's tunnels. It was a mass grave wearing the mask of a garden. As dusk fell and the last office worker departed, Leo returned. The transformation was immediate and profound. The park, emptied of life, seemed to shed its benign disguise. The streetlights on its perimeter cast long, skeletal shadows from the birch trees, which now looked less like ornaments and more like sentinels over a barren field. The air grew still and noticeably colder than the surrounding streets, a cold that rose from the ground itself. The cheerful birdsong was gone, replaced by the hollow, distant cooing of a wood pigeon, a sound like a mournful bell. He walked to the center, near the dry bird fountain. The sense of dissonance sharpened into something visceral. It was not a feeling of being watched by a single entity, but of being submerged in a collective emotion so vast it had a tangible density. A crushing, airless despair pressed down on him, seeping up through the soles of his shoes. It was the weight of thousands of simultaneous, unmourned endings, the terror of the fever, the loneliness of the deathbed, the final, confused plunge into the dark lime. This was not the sorrow of a single ghost, but the psychic residue of a demographic catastrophe. The ground was not haunted, it was saturated. He stood there as full night claimed the city, the cold intensifying, seeping into his marrow. He switched on his recorder, but he knew no microphone could capture this atmospheric pressure. It was a feeling in the diaphragm, a tightness in the throat. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, his imagination, fueled by Dr. Armitage's ledgers, conjured the scene. The rumble of cartwheels on cobbles, the grunt of laborers, the soft, terrible thuds of bodies falling into the trench. Then the wind picked up. It was a low, sighing breeze that wound through the birch trees, stirring the branches. But as it crossed the open space of the park, it changed. It gathered sound, not voices, not words, but a cacophony of weak, desperate exhalations. It was a symphony of final breaths, a wet, rattling cough that dissolved into a whimper, a shallow, frantic gasp for air that found none, a low, continuous moan of pain that had no source and everywhere. The whispers were not intelligent, not trying to communicate. They were sonic fossils, the last sounds made by lungs filled with fluid, etched into the very air that now moved over the pit. They were the whispers of a crowd dying together, a horrible, rustling chorus carried on the night wind. Leo opened his eyes, his breath coming in short, sharp clouds. The despair was now a physical force, a tide threatening to pull him under. He felt a profound, irrational urge to lie down on the cold grass to let the weight claim him. The cheerful park was utterly gone. In its place was a void, a negative space in the city where hope had been excavated and buried under countless layers of quicklime and clay. The whispers on the wind were not calling for help. They were simply being, a perpetual reenactment of the moment of extinction, a sound that the earth had memorized and played back when the conditions were right. He stumbled back, breaking the terrible spell, retreating towards the iron railings that bordered the park. As he crossed the threshold from grass to pavement, the pressure lifted as suddenly as a vacuum seal breaking. The cold receded to a normal night chill. The whispering wind faded, becoming just wind again in the city's canyons. He leaned against the railing, his legs unsteady, and looked back. The park was just a dark shape between buildings, a patch of lesser darkness, but he knew now what it contained. The plague pit was not a haunting in the conventional sense. It was a wound in the city's psyche that had never healed, a pocket of raw historical trauma preserved under a lawn. The ghosts here were not individuals, but a chorus of the erased, their final collective sigh forever trapped in the turn of the wind over a forgotten grave. They asked for nothing, remembered no one, and offered only the overwhelming, impersonal despair of a number too large to comprehend, a despair that waited, patient as geology, for the living to stand still long enough to feel it sink into their bones. The clues were always in the gaps, the omissions, the cartographic size. Every documented haunting on Leo's list, there seemed to be a corresponding silence, a place so thoroughly forgotten it had become a rumor, a whisper among enthusiasts of the city's hidden veins. His research into the underground spectral passengers had inevitably led him down this side tunnel of lore, the story of the station that was built but never opened, the ghost in the system's own blueprint. They called it the British Museum Station. According to fragmented archives and the passionate, typed-up digests of transit historians, it was a casualty of proximity and progress. Planned as part of the Central London Railway in the early 1900s, its platforms were supposedly constructed mere yards from those of the already operational Holborn station, a redundancy deemed unnecessary, almost as soon as the tunneling shields broke through. The official story was that it was abandoned during construction, its tunnels repurposed, its entrance never seeing the light of day. But the myths persisted, tales of maintenance workers hearing phantom train whistles in sealed shafts, of urban explorers in the 1970s claiming to have found tiled passages marked with half-finished signs, of a distinct, cold draft on the westbound Central Line between Tottenham Court Road and Holborn, where no draft should be. Leo's source was a retired tube engineer he tracked down to a quiet pub in Ealing. The old man, his hands permanently stained with a grime that soap couldn't reach, spoke over a pint of mild. He didn't talk of ghosts. He talked of alignments, of Victorian surveyor's marks still visible on brickwork in maintenance adits, of a specific persistent damp patch on a tunnel wall that no amount of grouting could ever fix. "You follow the curve from Holborn westbound," he muttered, sketching invisible lines on the wet tabletop with a blunt finger. 830 paces. There's a change in the brickwork, older, a different kiln batch. The arch is lower, and if you look up, right at the crown in the right light, you can sometimes see it, faint like a water stain. The letters B and M, that was all Leo needed. Not a ghost story, but a set of instructions. A puzzle. The station wasn't haunted because it was never alive, but perhaps the idea of it, the solidified intention left buried in the dark, had its own kind of presence. He secured permission for a track-level inspection walk, a routine safety procedure for which his press credentials, bolstered by a vague query about infrastructure heritage, were just sufficient. He was to be escorted by a current line engineer, but the escort, a pragmatic young woman named Simran, was under strict orders not to deviate from the maintenance walkway. She was his chaperone to the edge of the mystery, and no further. The descent into the live tunnel at Holborn, during the pre-dawn engineering hours, was a plunge into a world of echoing vastness and claustrophobic intimacy. The air was warm, thick with the ozone tang of electricity and the iron dust scent of braking trains. Powerful work lights on tripods cast stark, overlapping pools of illumination, but beyond them the tunnel curved away into a throat of absolute black. The silence was a physical thing, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional startling clang from somewhere in the darkness. Simran walked briskly ahead, her high-vis vest a beacon, her boots crunching on the ballast. Leo counted his paces, his own torch beam scanning the curved walls. The brickwork was a monotonous, sooty red, punctuated by cables, pipes, and occasional metal doors leading to unknown niches. He saw nothing unusual for the first 700 paces. Then, as the old engineer had predicted, the texture changed. The bricks here were slightly larger, their edges more rounded, the mortar a darker gray. The arch of the tunnel dipped lower, forcing Simran to duck her head slightly. The atmosphere changed, too. The warm, mechanical breath of the tube gave way to a cooler, damper air that smelled of older earth and stagnant water. "This is it," Simran said, stopping. She shone her light on a modern, locked metal door set into the wall. "Access to a condensate pump chamber. Nothing exciting, we turn back here." Her tone brooked no argument. This was the limit of their authorized route, but Leo's torch was already moving, sweeping upwards towards the crown of the lower, older arch. Brick was black with decades of grime, streaked with pale mineral deposits from seepage. He played the light slowly across the curved surface. And there, just as the old man had said, he saw it. It wasn't a water stain. It was deliberate, faded almost to nothing, but unmistakable under the direct beam. 2 letters about a foot high, formed from tiles of a slightly different, creamier hue than the surrounding brick. They were set within a shallow, arched recess, like a blind window or a sealed BM. The letters were elegant, serifed, a fragment of a sign meant for a public that never arrived. They were a fossilized intention, a signpost to nowhere. The air around the spot was perceptibly colder, a still, dry chill that seemed to emanate from the tiles themselves. Leo felt a jolt that was part triumph, part profound unease. He had found the station that wasn't there, or at least its nameplate. His gaze dropped from the letters to the tunnel wall directly beneath them. The brickwork here was irregular. The pattern was disrupted not by a modern metal door, but by a larger, older archway completely bricked up. The bricks filling the arch were a mismatched patchwork, their mortar newer and cruder than the surrounding Victorian work. But the outline was clear, a wide, graceful arch, taller than a man, its keystone still visible. It looked like the sealed entrance to a side passage or a platform tunnel. This wasn't just a change in kiln batch, this was a door. A door that had been deliberately, permanently closed. Simran was getting impatient, calling his name. Leo took a final, long look. The sealed archway under the ghostly BM did not feel like a piece of engineering. It felt like a threshold, a barrier between the world of functioning trains and scheduled stops and another, parallel world of abandoned intentions and frozen time. The British Museum station was a place that existed only in the negative space of the map, and he was standing before its locked front door. The chill from the tiles seeped into his bones. He had come to document hauntings, but this was different. This was the haunting of potential itself, of a place that had never known life and therefore might hold a different, purer kind of silence. He took a photograph, the flash glaring off the old tiles, before turning to follow Simran back towards the light and the living world. But the image of that ornate, bricked-up arch was seared into his mind. It wasn't an end point. It was an invitation, written in 2 faded letters and sealed with century-old mortar, waiting in the dark. The chill from the faded BM tiles lingered on Leo's skin long after he had ascended back to the waking world. The image of the bricked-up archway, a doorway to a place that officially did not exist, haunted his thoughts more vividly than any specter. It represented a different order of mystery, not a lingering soul, but a stillborn space, a pocket of pure potential forever suspended in the dark. The other sites held echoes of lives lived. This one promised the echo of a function never performed, of crowds that never gathered, of a destination that was never reached. That night in the quiet of his flat, the pull became irresistible. He had to listen at the door. He returned not through official channels, which were now closed to him, but through the city's other, older network, the network of forgotten passages and service, ways known only to a handful of explorers. A contact from his research, a taciturn urban historian named Felix, provided a route, a disused ventilation shaft near Bloomsbury, its rusted grate loose, leading to a narrow, unmapped conduit that ran parallel to the live Central Line tunnels. It was a journey of grit and constriction, of squeezing through spaces that smelled of rat droppings and wet rust. Felix led the way with a practiced, silent efficiency, and after an hour of crawling and crouching, they emerged into a wider, older passage. The air was dead here, utterly still and cold, untouched by the mechanical breath of the adjacent railway. Felix pointed a gloved hand down the passage. 30 yards, the arch is on your left, I'll wait here. His expression in the gloom was unreadable, but his stance made it clear he would go no further. This was as close as he ever came. Leo approached alone, his headlamp cutting a solitary beam through the dust-laden air. The passage was lined with the same older, larger bricks he'd seen from the maintenance walkway, and there it was, the sealed arch. Up close it was even more imposing. The brickwork filling it was a botched job, uneven and hurried, as if the workers had been keen to seal away whatever lay behind it as quickly as possible. The original keystone was a single, smooth block of granite, and around the edges of the fill, Leo could see the ghost of ornate tilework, geometric patterns in deep green and cream, a hint of the station's intended elegance. He stood before it, the silence absolute. This was the heart of the myth. He switched off his headlamp, plunging himself into a darkness so complete it felt like a solid object against his eyes. He needed to listen without the distraction of sight, to let the space speak on its own terms. He placed his palms flat against the cold, rough bricks of the fill. The mortar was icy to the touch. At first, there was nothing, just the deafening silence of the deep earth and the slow, rhythmic thump of his own heart. He leaned closer, pressing his ear directly against the bricks. The cold seeped into his cheekbone. He closed his eyes, focusing all his attention on the barrier. And then he heard it. A low, rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff, distant but distinct, the unmistakable sound of a steam locomotive working its pistons. It was followed by the faint, metallic screech of brakes being applied, a sound from a different era of engineering. His breath caught in his throat. The sounds were muffled, as if heard through thick earth and time, but they were undeniably there, crisp, mechanical, and real. They conjured an instant image, a train pulling into a pristine, empty platform, its carriages gleaming under gaslight. As the phantom train sounds faded, another noise filtered through. A human voice, tinny and distorted as if through an early, inefficient loudspeaker. It was a station announcer's call, the words blurred by static and distance, but the cadence was unmistakably official, bureaucratic. He caught a fragment that might have been, next train, and the tail word that sounded like platform. It was a routine announcement for a service that had never run, in a station that had never opened. Then the air changed. A new scent wove through the stale dampness of the passage. It was the rich, gritty smell of coal smoke, not the acrid diesel or ozone of the modern underground, but the warmer, dirtier perfume of burning bituminous coal. It was the smell of steam and industry of the early 20th century. It hung in the still air, a sensory ghost as potent as any sound. Leo remained frozen, his ear glued to the bricks, his senses reeling. This was not a residual haunting of emotion or trauma. This was a haunting of purpose. The station, as a conceived and partially built entity, had a function: to receive trains, to guide passengers, to announce arrivals. That intended function, it seemed, had left an imprint so strong it continued to play out in the void behind the bricks. The sounds and smells were not of tragedy, but of operation. The station that wasn't there was, in some paradoxical way, still running its shifts, forever awaiting its first and only passenger. A deep, resonant shudder vibrated through the brickwork, a tremor that passed through Leo's body. It felt like the passing of something immense and heavy very close by, a train on the other side of the wall in a tunnel that shouldn't exist. The coal smoke scent intensified for a moment, then began to fade, as if the phantom engine was moving away, its duty done. He finally stepped back, switching his headlamp back on. The beam illuminated the crude, sealed arch, now just a wall again, but everything had changed. He hadn't just found a historical curiosity, he had eavesdropped on a parallel timeline, a ghost of infrastructure. The British Museum Station was a place forever poised on the brink of existence, perpetually performing the rituals of its aborted purpose. It was the most profound haunting of all, the echo of what might have been, trapped in the dark. Sounding its whistle and smelling of coal smoke for an audience of none, save for the rare listener who pressed an ear to its sealed lips. The station wasn't there, but in every way that mattered to the senses, it absolutely was. The Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, was not a building that whispered, it declared. Its great green dome, crowned with a gilded statue of justice blindfolded and swordless, dominated the surrounding streets, a monument to the absolute final power of human law. Stone walls, blackened by centuries of London's soot, seemed to absorb the daylight, holding it in a stern, gray embrace. This was not a place of lingering emotion like the Tower, or of private sorrow like the riverbank. This was a place of verdicts, of conclusions carved in oak and recorded in ink. The air around it tasted of cold stone and implacable authority. Leo entered through the public door, his press credentials securing him an appointment with a senior clerk, a man named Mr. Aldridge. The public galleries and courtrooms were bustling with the grim theater of the day's proceedings. Barristers in wigs and gowns sweeping through marbled halls, the murmur of anxious families, the clack of heels on polished floors. But Mr. Aldridge led him away from all that, into the administrative heart of the building, a labyrinth of narrow, linoleum-floored corridors that smelled of dust, old paper, and lemon-scented polish. Their destination was a small, windowless office, its shelves bowed under the weight of leather-bound ledgers. Mr. Aldridge was a man in his late 60s, with the pallor of someone who has spent a lifetime under artificial light. His movements were precise, his speech measured, as if each word were being weighed for evidentiary value. He spoke of the court's history, its famous trials, its architecture. But as the official tour concluded, he paused, his fingers resting on the spine of a particularly ancient-looking volume. He looked at Leo, not with the conspiratorial glee of a storyteller, but with the weary resignation of a man burdened by a fact. "You're here for the other stories, I presume," Mr. Aldridge said, his voice dropping. "The ones not in the visitor's guide." He didn't wait for confirmation. "We have our share, the weeping woman in the cells, the scent of pipe tobacco in judge's corridor, but the most persistent, the most substantial, is the Black Judge." He explained that this was not a reference to any specific historical magistrate. It was a title that had emerged from the accounts of night watchmen and cleaning staff over many decades. A figure, always described similarly, tall, draped in the black robes and full-bottomed wig of an earlier century, seen pacing the empty corridors of the first-floor landing after midnight. He was never seen in a courtroom, only in the spaces between them, the hallways where justice was deliberated, not delivered. He paced with a slow, heavy tread, his head bowed as if in profound, burdensome thought. No one had ever seen his face, no one had ever heard him speak, but they feel him, Mr. Aldridge said, his eyes distant. A pressure, a sense of stern disapproval, as if you've interrupted a most solemn private meditation. The air grows cold, not with a chill, but with a sort of focused austerity. He recounted a cleaner's story from the 1950s, a woman who had seen the figure turn a corner, and upon following, found the corridor utterly empty, the only sound the echo of her own frightened breath. More recently, a security guard had resigned after reporting that the pacing figure had stopped, turned its unseen face towards him, and raised a single, admonishing finger before dissolving into the shadows. "It is not a malevolent spirit, we believe," Mr. Aldridge concluded, closing the ledger with finality. "It is the ghost of judgment itself, of the weight of decision, the endless pacing of a mind forever weighing evidence in a trial that has no end." He granted Leo permission to sit in one of the older, disused courtrooms after hours, a place where the atmosphere might be felt. "Courtroom number 2, he said. "It's quiet there." As dusk fell and the great building emptied of the living, Leo found himself sitting alone in the oak-paneled silence of Courtroom 2. It was a smaller space than the grand modern courts, but more intense for its intimacy. The public gallery was a dark void above. The jury box sat empty, its 12 chairs like waiting sentinels. The witness stand was a lonely wooden perch, and above it all the judge's bench loomed, a fortress of carved oak and green leather, elevated to impose perspective and finality. Leo sat in the well of the court, a supplicant before the empty throne. The air was still and dry, carrying the faint, sweet smell of old wood and the beeswax used to polish it for generations. The silence here was unique. It was not the hollow silence of the underground or the saturated silence of the plague pit. This was a cultivated silence, a silence that had been demanded, enforced, and then left to settle. It was the silence after a verdict has been uttered, when the gavel's echo has faded and the consequences begin their slow, irreversible unspooling. He waited, his recorder on the bench beside him. The dim emergency lighting cast long, dramatic shadows, making the carvings on the panels seem to shift and leer. He thought of the black judge, pacing the corridors outside, forever deliberating. He wondered what evidence was being weighed in that endless trial, the collective guilt of the condemned, the fallibility of the law itself. Then he felt it, a gaze. It did not come from the door or the gallery. It came from the judge's bench. It was a sensation of being scrutinized, assessed with a cold, dispassionate clarity that stripped away all pretense. It was the feeling of being a specimen under a lens, every flaw and failing laid bare. It was not hostile, but utterly devoid of mercy. A stern, unwavering disapproval settled over him, as palpable as a weight on his shoulders. The air in the courtroom grew dense and cold, not with a natural chill, but with the frost of absolute, unimpassioned judgment. Leo did not dare look up at the empty bench. He kept his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden floor before him. The feeling of being judged was so acute, so personal, that he found himself mentally cataloging his own life, his compromises, his small dishonesties, the times he had walked away, the article he was writing that felt increasingly like an exploitation of sorrow. The black judge was not judging him for a crime, but for his essence. The court was in session, and he was the only one in the dock. The pressure built, a psychic gravity pinning him to the hard wooden seat. The stern gaze felt ancient, weary, and inexorable. This was the haunting not of a person, but of a principle, the terrible, lonely burden of passing sentence, of holding the line between society and chaos, of wearing the mask of certainty while knowing the law was a blunt instrument in a world of sharp human complexities. And then the sound, a single, crisp, authoritative knock. It came from the judge's bench, the sound of a gavel falling once decisively on its block. It was not a loud sound, but in the profound silence it was as shocking as a gunshot. It echoed off the paneled walls, a note of pure, final closure. In its wake, the gaze lifted, the pressure vanished, the cold retreated. The courtroom was just a room again, empty and still. Leo sat for a long time, breathing slowly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The single knock had not been a beginning, but an end, a verdict delivered, on what or on whom he could not say, but the trial was over. The black judge had passed sentence in his court of one and had moved on, back to his eternal pacing in the corridors, forever burdened with the next case, the next weighty decision in the endless night of the law. He left courtroom number 2, the sound of that solitary gavel echoing in his mind. It was the most unambiguous supernatural sound he had yet captured, yet it felt like the least explicable. The other ghosts cried or played music or sighed. This one judged. And in the silent, august darkness of the Old Bailey, Leo had stood before the bench and been found wanting, not for any specific sin, but simply for being human in a place that dealt in absolutes. The sentence, whatever it was, had been passed, and he carried the eerie weight of it out into the night, a new and chilling entry in his catalogue of London's echoes. The Imperial War Museum was a temple of curated conflict, a vast, somber edifice where the cacophony of history was subdued into glass cases, typed labels, and the respectful hush of visitors. Sunlight streamed through the great dome of the central atrium, illuminating suspended fighter planes and artillery pieces, turning instruments of destruction into silent, suspended sculptures. The air smelled of polish, old paper, and a faint metallic tang from the preserved machinery. It was a place of remembrance, not of fear, a sanctuary where the chaos of the past was ordered, explained, and laid to rest. Yet, as Leo had learned, even the most meticulously catalogued trauma could leave residues that no display case could contain. He had come for the First World War galleries, and specifically for the life-size replica of a trench system in the bowels of the building. His contact was a docent, a retired history teacher named Mrs. Ainsley, whose gentle voice and cardigan-clad demeanor belied a deep, personal connection to the material. She found him studying a case of personal effects, tarnished whistles, mud-stained letters, a broken pair of spectacles. Her approach was quiet, and when she began to speak, it was not about the grand strategy of the psalm, but about the gallery after hours. It's the only part of the museum that ever unsettles the night. Staff, she said, her eyes, magnified by thick lenses, scanning the fake sandbags and duckboards of the exhibit entrance. Not often, but sometimes on the security monitors they see a figure, just a silhouette down in the trench, always in the same spot near the periscope. It doesn't move, it just stands. She adjusted her cardigan, a nervous gesture. They call it the warden, a sentry who never stood down. She explained that the feeling reported was not one of menace, but of profound, weary vigilance. A sense of being watched from that dark, reconstructed hole in the ground, a watchfulness that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights in the mud. Once a cleaning lady had refused to enter the gallery alone after hearing a soft, rhythmic scraping, like a shovel methodically digging in wet earth. The sound had no source. They say it's a regret, Mrs. Ainsley whispered, leaning closer. Not a regret of action, but of inaction, of seeing what was coming from his observation. Post and being powerless to stop it, a warden who watched the wire and the smoke and the men going over the top, day after day, until the watching itself became his eternal duty. She left him with a sympathetic smile and a reminder that the museum would be closing in an hour. Leo watched her go, her sensible shoes whispering on the parquet floor. The grand hall felt suddenly less like a museum and more like a mausoleum for modern ages. He waited as the crowds thinned, as the last school group chattered its way towards the exit, and the immense building began its nightly transition from public education to private memory. When the final announcement echoed through the atrium, Leo slipped away from the main thoroughfare and descended the stairs to the lower-level galleries. The trench experience was accessed through a dark, sloping tunnel, designed to disorient and immerse. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying an artificially induced scent of loam and cordite. He passed through the dimly lit staging areas, a command dugout with maps, a first aid post, before emerging into the trench itself. It was unnervingly effective. The walls were revetted with woven sticks and corrugated iron, the floor a mix of duckboards and deep, fake mud. The sky was a ceiling painted a perpetual, gloomy twilight. The silence here was different from the hushed reverence of the galleries above. It was a thick, claustrophobic quiet, broken only by the faint, recorded sounds of distant shelling and wind played through hidden speakers. Now, with the museum closed, even those sounds were off. The trench was a dead snapshot, a diorama of frozen terror. He walked its length slowly, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the wooden boards. He passed a bunk bed with rough blankets, a rusted brazier, a pile of sandbags. The air was still and cold, the manufactured dampness feeling all too real. He felt the isolation, the sense of being buried alive in this carefully constructed grave. At the far end, positioned to look out over a scarred no-man's land depicted in a painted panorama, stood the periscope, a simple two-mirrored device on a wooden pole, the kind used to peer over the parapet without exposing one's head. This was the spot Mrs. Ainsley had mentioned. Leo approached it. The trench here was a dead end. The feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling on the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It was the feeling described by the night staff, a weary, patient vigilance focused on him, the intruder in this silent, subterranean world. He looked into the lower eyepiece of the periscope. It was designed to reflect the view from the upper mirror, which would be above the trench parapet. In the museum context, it simply reflected a painted scene of blasted trees and shell craters. He saw the gloomy panorama, static and artificial. Then, on an impulse, he straightened up and moved around to the other side of the periscope. He bent and put his eye to the upper mirror, the one that should be reflecting the interior of the trench itself, the empty, deserted diorama behind him. The image in the mirror was not of an empty trench. Reflected in the old, slightly speckled glass was the silhouette of a soldier. He was standing where Leo now stood, facing the periscope, his form dark and solid against the lighter background of the sandbag wall. He wore the distinctive helmet and bulky tunic of a great war infantryman. His head was slightly bowed, as if peering intently into the device, his features obscured in shadow. The image was clear, detailed, heartbreakingly real. A jolt of ice shot through Leo's veins. He whipped around. The trench behind him was empty, utterly, unquestionably empty. He was alone in the silent, fake mud and woven sticks. The only sound was his own ragged breath. He looked back at the periscope, then again at the empty space where the figure had appeared to be. Nothing. With trembling hands, he bent again to the upper mirror. The soldier was still there. The same bowed head, the same patient, vigilant stance. He was a reflection of a presence that existed only in the glass, a sentry standing guard in a parallel version of the trench that only the periscope could see. Leo stared, mesmerized by the impossible detail, the fold of the uniform at the shoulder, the strap of the helmet, the absolute stillness. This was no misty apparition. This was a man captured in the act of his duty, forever frozen in the silvered glass. And then the figure in the mirror slowly raised its head. Leo could not see its face, only the dark hollow where a face should be, but he felt its gaze. It was not the stern judgment of the black judge, nor the hungry attention of the tall figure. It was a gaze of infinite, weary regret. A regret that watched the present from its fixed point in the past, seeing the museum, the visitor, the peaceful world that had somehow emerged from the cataclysm it had witnessed, and found no comfort in it, the regret of a warden who had seen too much, too early, and whose only remaining purpose was to stand his post and watch, through the ghostly lens of a periscope, as history repeated its mistakes in different forms. Leo stepped back, breaking the line of sight. When he looked again, the upper mirror showed only the empty, sandbagged wall of the trench. The soldier was gone. The feeling of being watched faded, leaving behind a profound, echoing sadness that seemed to seep from the very earth of the diorama. He left the trench experience quickly, climbing back to the bright, ordered atrium. The contrast was jarring. Up here, war was a subject, a series of exhibits. Down there, in the reflection of an old mirror, it was still a living, breathing watchfulness. The warden's regret was not for a life lost, but for a vigil that never ended. He was not haunting the museum. He was permanently stationed in its deepest gallery, forever manning his observation post, his war never. Over his duty eternally unrelieved, seeing only the reflection of an empty trench that would never again know the horror he awaited. The periscope wasn't a museum piece, it was a window, and on the other side of the glass, a soldier was still watching. The London Library was a fortress of silence, but not the dead, interred silence of the plague pit or the listening stillness of the museum. This was a living, cultivated quiet, a product of concentration and respect, thick as velvet and just as soft. It smelled of a million aging pages, a complex perfume of dry paper, old leather, and the faint, sweet dust of disintegrating cloth bindings. Sunlight, filtered through high, grimy windows, fell in slanted, golden bars across endless rows of dark wood shelves that stretched up into shadowy galleries. The only sounds were the occasional discreet cough, the soft scuff of a shoe on worn carpet, and the gentle thump of a volume being closed. It was a sanctuary for thought, a place where the past was not haunting, but patiently waiting to be consulted. Leo had come seeking context, a scholarly footnote to balance the visceral terror of his other encounters. He wanted to find a rational, historical thread in the personal diaries or local histories that might explain the patterns he was seeing. He found his source not in a book, but in a person, an elderly member named Mr. Thorne, who seemed as much a part of the library's fabric as the Edwardian shelving. They met in the members' room, amidst deep armchairs and the gentle ticking of a long-case clock. Mr. Thorne's voice was a papery whisper, perfectly suited to the environment. "You are researching the city's echoes," Mr. Thorne stated, his milky blue eyes studying Leo over the rim of his teacup. It wasn't a question. A worthy, if melancholy, pursuit. Most come here for facts. You seek the annotations in the margin. He set his cup down with a precise click. There is a story here, too. Not a loud one, a whisper, about a scholar. He described a figure seen only by a handful of dedicated nocturnal readers over the decades. A man in late Victorian dress, his coat slightly threadbare, his face perpetually obscured by shadow and the angle of a reading lamp. He was always in the history and topography section, in the deepest stacks on the third floor. He was never seen to move from a particular carrel. He was simply present. A reader so absorbed in his work that he had failed to notice the passage of a century. The phenomenon was never one of sound or temperature, but of absence. A book, desperately sought by a researcher, would be found to be missing from its shelf, only to be discovered later that evening or the next morning, placed open on a desk in that secluded carrel, as if left for consultation. The pages would often be open to a passage of obscure relevance to the seeker's own work. The spectral scholar, it seemed, was not haunting the library, he was curating it. He is the silence between the notes, Mr. Thorne murmured, the perfect librarian. He finds what you need before you know you need it. His haunting is one of impeccable posthumous service. With that, the old man gathered his things and melted back into the stacks, leaving Leo with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cool, still air. Intrigued, Leo took the wrought iron staircase to the third floor. The air grew closer here, the silence more profound, broken only by the distant hum of a ventilation fan. The history stacks were a canyon of knowledge, the shelves so high they required wheeled ladders to access their upper reaches. The light was dimmer, pooled in small islands around green-shaded lamps on the few reading desks or carrels tucked into alcoves. He chose a carrel at the very end of a row, a wooden cubicle with high sides that created a private cell of study. He spread out his own notes, his list of locations, his transcribed recordings. He was looking for a connection, a name, a date that might tie the disparate hauntings together, a foolish hope perhaps, but the library invited such systematic folly. He worked for hours, the silence wrapping around him like a blanket, his focus deepening. The outside world with its ghosts and chills receded. Here there was only the text, the note, the cross-reference. His eyes grew tired. He leaned back, rubbing them. When he looked again at the worn surface of the carrel desk, a new book lay before him. It had not been there a moment ago, he was certain. Desk had held only his notebook, his pen, and a sheaf of photocopied pages from the British Library. The volume was large, bound in faded crimson cloth with gilt lettering on the spine that had all but flaked away. The title, stamped in barely legible gold, read, A Survey of London's Psychical Resonances, a treatise on mnemonic hauntings by Alastair W.G. Finch, 1899. The name meant nothing to him. The book was not part of his requested pile. He had never heard of it. His heart began a slow, heavy beat. He looked around the carrel. He was utterly alone. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic squeak of a librarian's trolley somewhere floors below. No one had approached. No shadow had passed. Hesitantly, he reached out and touched the cover. The cloth was cool and slightly rough. He opened it. The pages were thick, high-quality paper, yellowed at the edges but still supple. The smell of old ink and time rose to meet him. The book fell open naturally to a specific chapter, as if it had been read most often at this point. The chapter heading was, On the Perpetuation of Emotional Imprints in Urban Geology. His breath caught. He began to read. The prose was dense, academic, but the thesis was startlingly clear. Finch, writing at the twilight of the Victorian era, argued that hauntings were not the work of individual souls, but the result of intense, collective, or personal emotion becoming imprinted upon a specific location, a psychical resonance. He compared it to a phonographic recording, where the needle of a traumatic event cut a groove into the very substance of a place, and under the right conditions, of quiet, of similar emotional frequency in a visitor, of temporal alignment, the recording could play back. He wrote of the tower's sorrow, the Thames's despair, the repetitive mechanical echoes of industry. He described exactly what Leo had been experiencing, not encounters with personalities, but with events frozen in time and re-experienced. The relevant page was open to a subsection discussing the librarian function, the theory that certain resonances could develop a low-level awareness, a tendency to interact with or guide sensitive individuals towards understanding. Finch speculated that in places dedicated to knowledge, like a library, a resonance might manifest as a benign, scholarly presence subtly arranging information. Leo sat back, a cold thrill racing down his spine that was entirely intellectual. This was it. The corroboration. The theory that made sense of the sobs at the tower, the warm breath in the underground, the rearranged ushapties. He hadn't been chasing ghosts. He had been walking through recorded history, playing back its most traumatic and routine moments. The book was a century-old key to the mystery, placed directly in his hands. He looked up from the page, half expecting to see the shadowy Victorian scholar standing at the end of the aisle, his work done. But there was only the endless, silent corridor of books, the pools of lamplight, the deep, knowing quiet. The librarian's silence was not an absence, it was an offering. The spectral scholar had completed his research long ago, and from his eternal carol he was still facilitating the work of others, placing the perfect volume on the desk of anyone who sought to understand the echoes. The haunting here was one of pure, undiluted intellect, a ghost that didn't weep or warn, but simply provided. In the heart of London's greatest repository of knowledge, Leo had been given the final piece of his own puzzle, not by a whisper, but by the profound, eloquent silence of a book that had found its reader, delivered by hands that had last turned its pages when the city was lit by gas, and its ghosts were only a theory. The studio in Chelsea was a cathedral of light and dust. Tall north-facing windows, their panes rippled with age, bathed the vast, cluttered space in a cool, diffuse glow that seemed to bleach color from the world, turning it into a study in gray and gold. Canvases leaned against every wall, some blank, others bearing the ghostly charcoal outlines of figures never realized. The air was thick with the astringent perfume of turpentine, the earthy smell of linseed oil, and the dry, sweet scent of aging paper. It was a place of potential, where reality was distilled into pigment and line, and where, Leo was beginning to understand, the boundary between the seen and the unseen was as thin as a coat of gesso. The artist, man named Silas with hands permanently stained by umber and ultramarine, moved through the chaos with the quiet reverence of a priest. He was in his 70s, his beard a wild tangle of white, his eyes the pale, penetrating blue of someone who spends a lifetime looking not at surfaces, but at the light behind them. He had agreed to speak of the studio's peculiar resident not as a ghost story, but as a matter of artistic fact. "He is not a subject," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur as he cleaned a brush with a rag. "She is a condition of the light, a flaw in the glass perhaps, or a perfection." He gestured towards an enormous freestanding mirror in a gilded frame, its silvering foxed with age, that stood in a corner between two windows. "She appears only there, in reflection, never in the room itself. You can look directly at the space it shows and see nothing, but look into the glass and sometimes she is there." He described her as a woman of extraordinary, melancholic beauty, dressed in the fashion of the late 1860s, a gown of deep sapphire blue velvet, with a high neck and intricate jet beading. Her hair was arranged in elaborate coils, dark as polished mahogany. She never smiled. Her expression was one of profound, silent sorrow, her eyes large and dark, seeming to hold a private grief that had outlasted her lifetime. She was not a full figure, but a portrait, appearing from the shoulders up, as if she were standing just behind whoever looked into the mirror. She was, Silas believed, a model who had sat for a painter in this studio, or one that stood on this spot long before and whose image had been absorbed by the one object designed to capture likeness, the mirror itself. Her haunting was one of arrested creation, a pose held forever. "She is the perfect model," Silas said, a wistful note in his voice. "Eternally still, infinitely patient. She never tires, never complains, but she brings her own mood with her, on days she appears. The light in the studio feels heavier, more liquid. It's impossible to paint anything frivolous." He showed Leo a series of small canvases, portraits and studies all infused with a deep blue-toned sadness. These are her days. She changes the atmosphere. She becomes the palette. Leo listened, fascinated. This was a haunting of aesthetics, of captured beauty and preserved sorrow. It was not violent or tragic, but elegiac. He asked if he might wait to see for himself. Silas simply nodded, returning to his work at a large easel, leaving Leo to wander the studio. The afternoon wore on. The light from the windows shifted, lengthening the shadows, turning the dust motes into swirling galaxies of gold. Leo found himself repeatedly drawn to the mirror. He would look into it, seeing the reflection of the cluttered studio, the windows, the spectral shapes of covered sculptures, and his own face looking increasingly weary and haunted. He saw no woman. Just the quiet, dust-choked room and his own watchful eyes. He turned his back to the mirror, examining a shelf of plaster casts, hands, feet, a fragment of a classical frieze. The silence was deep, broken only by the soft scratch of Silas's charcoal on canvas. Leo lost himself in the details of a broken Venus, tracing the smooth curve of the stone shoulder with his gaze. A flicker of movement in the periphery of his vision, in the dark glass of a framed painting opposite him, made him freeze. It was a reflection of the mirror behind him. And in that reflection, he saw not just his own back, but a figure standing directly behind his shoulder. His blood turned to ice. He saw the rich sapphire blue of velvet, the stark white of a lace collar at the neck, the dark, elaborate coils of hair. A pale, oval face, its features blurred by the double reflection but unmistakably feminine, and etched with that signature sorrow. She was there in the mirror, standing so close behind him he could have felt her breath on his neck, had she any. Breath to give, a jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The space behind him was empty. Sunlight fell on bare floorboards, dotted with paint splatters. A stray easel stood a few feet away. There was no woman in a blue dress, no presence of any kind. The air was still, smelling only of turpentine and dust. He turned back slowly to the framed painting, his reflection now wide-eyed and pale. The secondary reflection in its glass showed only the empty studio and the great mirror, now reflecting nothing but the room and his own startled form. She was gone. He walked to the mirror itself, standing directly before it. He saw his own face, strained and tired, the studio stretching away behind him. He looked into his own eyes in the glass, and then deliberately shifted his focus to the space just over his own shoulder. For a fleeting, heart-stopping second, he thought he saw a shimmer, a distortion in the air like heat haze, a suggestion of a darker blue against the gray wall, and in that distortion the faintest impression of a sorrowful eye, a curve of a pale cheek. Then it was gone, resolved back into the mundane reality of paint-spattered wall and shadow. It was not a full apparition. It was a whisper in silvered glass, a memory so vivid it could momentarily hijack a reflection. She wasn't in the room. She was in the mirror's memory of the room, a latent image that developed only under a certain quality of light or a certain quality of attention. Silas had stopped painting. He was watching Leo, his head tilted. "You saw her," he said, not a question. In a reflection, Leo breathed, his voice unsteady. "Not directly." Silas nodded, as if this confirmed a long-held theory. "She is of the mirror. She exists in the realm of likeness. To see her directly would be to make her real. And some things," he said, turning back to his canvas with a sigh, "are meant only to be reflected upon, not grasped." Leo left the studio as the last of the daylight faded. The image of the woman in blue seared into his mind's eye. He had encountered ghosts of sound, of smell, of touch, and of sheer presence. This was a ghost of sight, but a sight that could only be seen secondhand, through the mediation of glass and silver. The artist's eternal model was not a spirit trapped in a place, but an image trapped in a tool of perception. She was the perfect, unaging muse, forever posing in a studio made of light and memory, her profound sadness the only price for her eternal beauty. She would never leave that mirror, and anyone who sought her would find only their own face, and behind it in the depths of the glass, the lingering, sorrowful echo of a beauty that had once been, and forever was, just over their shoulder. The silence in Leo's flat had become a chorus. It was no longer the empty quiet of a solitary space, but a dense, layered stillness that seemed to vibrate with the memory of every whisper, every sigh, every footstep he had documented across London. The city's echoes had followed him home. They had seeped into the plaster, pooled in the corners, and now waited in the spaces between his own breaths. He sat at his desk, the digital recorder before him like a sacred relic, its small screen a window into a world of captured sorrows. The article was nearly complete, 15 locations, each with its own chilling, corroborated tale. But the work was no longer a journalistic exercise. It had become a vigil. The encounters were intensifying. It was no longer a matter of seeking them out in specific, charged locations. The phenomena were bleeding into the mundane fabric of his daily life. Walking through the supermarket, he would feel a sudden, localized cold spot in the cereal aisle, a chill that had nothing to do with refrigeration. On a crowded tube train, he would catch, clear as a bell amidst the rumble, the distant, mournful sob of the tower woman or the frantic scratching from Clerkenwell. Sounds that vanished when he focused, leaving only the baffled stares of fellow passengers. He felt watched constantly, not by the piercing hunger of the tall figure but by a diffuse collective attention. The feeling would descend in a cafe, in the library, even in the shower, a prickle on his neck, a sense of being the focal point for 100 unseen eyes. The city itself had become a vast, sentient audience, and he was the sole performer on its ghostlit stage. Recorded voices on his device had changed. They were no longer faint, ambiguous whispers snatched from the air. They had become clearer, more distinct, almost responsive. Playing back the file from the plague pit, he heard not just the cacophony of weak coughs, but a single, rasping voice that seemed to form words. So many, the child's cry from the prison, "Mama, please," now sometimes repeated itself, the second "please" stretched into a longer, more plaintive wail, as if reacting to his listening. The Phantom. Station announcers Mind the Gap had on one playback been followed by a soft, sighing exhalation. It felt less like reviewing evidence and more like holding a séance with a machine. The weight of it was crushing. The professional detachment he had clung to was gone, eroded by the sheer cumulative mass of other people's despair, regret, and unresolved moments. He was a vessel now, filled to the brim with spectral resonance. Sleep offered no respite. His dreams were not his own. They were collages of the sights: the tall figure standing in the Egyptian gallery, the man in gray walking through the wall of his kitchen, the drowner wading through his bedroom floor. He would wake with the taste of coal smoke or river mud in his mouth, the scent of lavender soap or brandy clinging to his sheets. He realized with a cold, certain dread that his attention had acted as a catalyst. By listening so intently, by documenting so meticulously, he had not simply observed the echoes, he had amplified them. He had tuned his own frequency to theirs, and now the signal was bleeding through, overwhelming the static of the living world. He was a lightning rod for London's grief, and the storm was converging. Overwhelmed, adrift in a city that had become a hall of mirrors reflecting its own traumatic past, he grasped for an anchor. He needed to ground himself, to find a fixed point in the shifting spectral tide. The logic was circular, desperate, but clear. He had to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of his research, but the beginning of his own visceral, undeniable experience. Before the whispers followed him home, before the cold spots bloomed in his kitchen, there had been the tower, the first true sighting, the woman in the Tudor gown and her sound of pure, crystallized sorrow. That encounter had been a door opening. Perhaps by returning to that specific threshold, he could understand the nature of the convergence, or at least face it on ground he somewhat knew. Decision brought a grim, focused calm. He would go back to the Tower of London, not for an interview, not for atmospheric notes. He would go to stand on the scaffold site in the deepest part of the night with his recorder running and listen. He would see if the echoes he carried with him would resonate with the one that had started it all. It felt less like an investigation and more like a summons. The ghosts had his attention. Now, it seemed, they wanted an audience. And Leo, burdened with their stories and haunted by their silence, had no choice but to attend. Midnight at the tower was a different kind of dark. It was not the absence of light, but its negation, a blackness woven from centuries of shadow, thickened by the cold breath of the Thames and the immense, silent weight of history. The moon was a bone sliver behind scudding clouds, offering no illumination, only a faint, pewter sheen on the lead roofs. Leo stood on the gravel of the scaffold site, the same cold parapet at his back. He was alone by special pleading arrangement with a night watchman who had looked at him with pity before locking the gate. The fortress was a kingdom of stone and memory, and he was its only living subject. He had come to listen, to see if the anchor would hold. But as he switched on his recorder and the tiny red eye glowed in the dark, he realized his mistake. He was not an anchor, he was a conductor. It began not with a single sound, but with a pressure change, a sudden dense silence that swallowed even the distant hum of the city. The air grew heavy, charged with a static potential. Then the cold came, not the uniform chill of the November night, but a patchwork of different colds, blooming around him like poisonous flowers. To his left, the biting, personal winter of the Highgate hunger enveloped his arm, freezing the moisture on his sleeve. To his right, the dry, antiseptic chill of the museum's Egyptian gallery seeped up through the gravel, carrying the scent of old linen and sand. Before him, the profound, riverdamp cold of the Thameside drowner washed over his legs, and behind, the austere, focused frost of the black judge's disapproval settled on his shoulders. He stood at the intersection of a dozen climates, each a perfect memory of a specific sorrow, and then the sounds converged. They did not come from the air, but from the ground, the stones, the very fabric of the night. They overlapped, wove together, a cacophony of London's grief played all at once. The mournful, choking sobs of the Tudor woman rose from the gravel beneath his feet, as fresh and agonizing as the first time. But now they were underscored by the frantic, gritty scratching from the Clerkenwell tunnels, a desperate counterpoint. The soft, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the Fleet Street printer's press beat a mechanical heart beneath it all, a metronome for the symphony of despair. Whispers swirled around his head, a tornado of lost words. The child's plaintive mama. Please tangled with the wet, rattling coughs from the plague pit. The crisp, polite, mind the gap from the underground spliced into the tinny fragment of the British Museum station announcer. The single, decisive gavel knock from the Old Bailey echoed, and echoed again, each repetition judged by the weary sigh of the warden from his trench. The clear, yearning saxophone phrase of the lost musician wound through it all, a thread of beauty in the tapestry of pain. He heard the dry rustle of the artist's model's velvet gown, the soft shush of the hotel chambermaid's starched apron, the metallic drag of chains from Trader's Gate. He heard the phantom footsteps of the man in gray pacing a corridor that wasn't there, and the slow, heavy tread of the tall figure moving through the cedar groves of Highgate. The sounds were not distant. They were immediate, intimate, as if each ghost had drawn close, pressed its mouth to his ear, and insisted on being heard. The sense arrived next, a riot. Of anachronism, the rich peat of fine brandy and cigar smoke from the war rooms clashed with the damp wool and river mud stench of the drowner. The floral hint of lavender soap from the hotel room bloomed beside the acrid tang of the prison's fear and the dry, spicy myrrh from the museum. The warm, damp coal smoke breath of the phantom tube train gusted past, followed by the stale beer and sawdust smell of the Soho Jazz Club. Leo staggered, his hands clapped over his ears, but it was no use. The sounds were not in the air, they were in his mind, vibrating in the marrow of his bones, a psychic resonance triggered by his presence and his profound, accumulated attention. He had documented them all, and now they were documenting him, using him as a focal point, a living crossroads where their disparate timelines could briefly intersect. He opened his eyes, tears of cold and overwhelm blurring his vision. The scaffold site was not empty. It was crowded with suggestions, with shimmering distortions in the darkness. He did not see full apparitions, but glimpses, a flash of gray coat in the periphery, a swirl of sapphire blue velvet in the corner of his eye, a tall, thin shadow against the white tower's bulk, the briefest impression of a bowed head in a soldier's helmet. They were not fully formed, but they were there, drawn to the beacon of his consciousness like moths to a flame. The convergence was not happening around him, it was happening through him. His recorder sat on the parapet, was a frantic scribe. Its tiny light blinked erratically, overwhelmed by the input. He knew the file would be a sonic avalanche, a useless, distorted roar of overlapping hauntings. The evidence was irrelevant now. He was the evidence. A final, unified cold seized him, a cold that was the essence of every chill he had ever felt, the cold of the grave, of the river, of judgment, of deep space. It locked his joints, stole his breath. In that absolute, paralyzing freeze, the cacophony reached its peak, a crescendo of London's echoing pain, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ceased. The sounds cut off. The sense vanished. The suggestive movements in the dark stilled. The patchwork of colds retreated, leaving only the natural, deep chill of the night. The ordinary silence of the fortress rushed back in, a silence that now felt deafening in its emptiness. Leo slumped against the parapet, gasping, his body trembling violently. The recorder's light had stopped blinking. Low to steady, calm red. He reached for it with numb fingers, fumbling to press stop. The act felt mundane, absurd. He had gone to the tower seeking an anchor, a single point of reference. Instead, he had become the nexus. The ghosts he had so diligently hunted were not independent specters. They were notes in a city-wide chord, and his focused attention had played them all at once. They had converged not on the location, but on the observer. The feature was no longer a story he was writing about London, it was a story London was writing through him. And as he stumbled away from the scaffold site, the gravel crunching with a shocking normality under his feet, he understood the final, terrifying truth. The haunting was not in the places. It was in the attention. And his attention had become an open door, through which every echo in the city was now keenly, cacophonously aware of him. The article was finished. 1,500 words of measured prose, a tapestry woven from historical records, eyewitness accounts, and his own carefully curated experiences. Leo sat before the glowing screen in his flat, the cursor blinking at the end of the final paragraph. Outside, a pale dawn was bleeding into the sky over Balham, turning the rooftops the color of old bone. The familiar sounds of the waking city, a distant bin lorry, the first birdsong, felt like whispers from another planet. His own words on the screen seemed alien, a pathetic reduction of the symphony of terror and sorrow that had been played through his soul on the tower's scaffold. He had written it all: the tower's weeping queen, Highgate's hungry watcher, the Thameside drowner's resigned descent. He had described the sounds, the scents, the chills with a journalist's precision, framing them as compelling mysteries, London's enduring echoes. He had even alluded to the theory from Finch's book, the idea of psychical resonance, giving the piece a veneer of intellectual speculation. It was good, it was publishable. It was exactly what the editor at Metropolitan Chronicles had commissioned. His finger hovered over the trackpad, over the send button. The weight of it pressed down on him, a physical ache in his chest. To publish was to broadcast, to take the whispers from the sealed archives of stone and shadow and pipe them into 1,000 brightly lit homes, onto 1,000 glowing screens. It was to invite the casual curiosity of readers over breakfast, the thrill-seeking of weekend explorers. Cynical dissection of skeptics. His attention had already acted as a catalyst, a lens focusing the diffuse energy of these places onto himself. What would the attention of thousands do? Would it amplify the signals further, disturb the delicate, grieving equilibrium he had witnessed? Would the tall figure find new warmth to taste? Would the child in Clerkenwell hear a cacophony of unfamiliar footsteps and retreat deeper into its eternal scratch? Would the warden's regret curdle into something else under the glare of public scrutiny? He thought of the convergence at the tower, the horrifying, beautiful clarity with which every ghost had spoken at once through him. That had been a private apocalypse. Publishing felt like inviting the world to a seance he could not control. But the alternative was silence, to bury the notes, delete the recordings, and let the echoes continue their lonely repetitions in the dark, unacknowledged. That felt like a deeper betrayal. The woman at the tower had sobbed for centuries. The drowner had walked into the Thames more times than could be counted. Their sorrows existed, monumental and real. Did they not deserve a witness? Wasn't the act of remembering, of recording, a form of respect? Finch's treatise suggested that resonance required a listener to complete the circuit. By listening, Leo had become part of their story. To now refuse to speak felt like abandoning a post. He looked at his hands, pale in the dawn light. They had held the recorder that captured the child's cry. They had brushed against the cold tankard in the Spaniard's Inn. They had trembled before the black judge's bench. They were no longer just a journalist's hands. They were stained with the residue of other people's eternities. With a sigh that came from the depths of his own newfound coldness, he moved the cursor. He attached the file, addressed the email to his editor, and typed a brief professional note. No hints of his turmoil. Then he closed his eyes and clicked send. A soft whoosh sounded from the speakers. It was done. The stories were no longer his. They were loose in the world. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street now gilded with morning sun. People were emerging, heading to work, walking dogs, living their lives in the solid present tense. But Leo saw the city differently now. He saw the layers. The modern pavement overlay older cobbles, which overlay Roman roads, which overlay forgotten streams and plague pits. The bustling coffee shop on the corner was built atop a foundation that might remember a different kind of heat, a different kind of crowd. London was not one city, but countless cities, each haunting the one that came after. His article ended with a reflection he had written in a moment of bleak clarity. London's hauntings are not anomalies, they are its geology. The city is built not just on clay and gravel, but on layers of memory, trauma, and love so intense they fossilized into perception. These echoes do not fade, they wait. They wait in the quiet between heartbeats, in the stillness of a closed door, in the fog on the river. They wait for the next observer, the next listener, the next heart whose frequency resonates with their own. The haunting is perpetual. The story never ends. He now felt the truth of those words in his marrow. The work was complete, but the burden was his forever. He had been the observer. He had resonated. Now, even here on this busy street in the clean morning light, he felt the cold emptiness. It was not a chill in the air, but a hollow in the world, a space where the warmth of the living seemed thin and temporary. He felt watched from the blank windows of passing buses, heard the ghost of a sigh in the rumble of an engine, sensed the patient, weary vigilance of the city's ancient stones beneath his feet. The ghosts had not followed him home. He had simply learned to see the home they had always inhabited. He turned from the window. The flat was silent, but it was the silence of the library, of the museum, of the sealed station, a silence that held volumes. He had told their stories, but he knew with a certainty that left him cold that the telling was just another chapter. The echoes were waiting. And he, the storyteller, would now forever walk the streets of a city that watched him back, its countless eyes open in the dark, its endless whispers just a breath away from the silence.